Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where curiosity moves slowly, history settles in quietly, and even the coldest corners of the earth can become a place to rest your thoughts for a while. Tonight, we're heading far south, beyond the last crowded harbours, beyond the ordinary maps of daily life, beyond the places where trees can grow and roads can be trusted, to a white frozen world where the wind does not seem to tire, where the sea can turn solid around a ship, and where a small group of men once had to learn how to stay alive when the world gave them almost nothing to work with. This is the story of Ernest Shackleton's expedition to Antarctica aboard the Endurance, and how 28 men survived more than 500 days trapped in one of the harshest environments on Earth. It is a story of ice, hunger, patience, fear, loyalty, and a kind of leadership that did not look grand from the outside. It looked like checking on a tired man in the dark. It looked like sharing the last warm drink. It looked like making jokes when there was very little reason to laugh. It looked like keeping people moving when stopping would have been easier, and sometimes much more tempting. Before we step into that frozen story, I wonder where you're listening from tonight. Are you somewhere warm, with rain tapping gently against a window, or somewhere already cold enough that the thought of Antarctica feels a little too close for comfort? Perhaps you are listening late at night tucked under a blanket while the room is quiet and the rest of the world has finally stopped asking things of you. Or perhaps it is morning where you are, and you're beginning your day with a tale from a place where the sun could vanish for months, and the word morning did not always mean very much at all. And here is a small question to carry with you as we begin. How do you think you would cope if everything familiar disappeared for more than a year? No bed, no home, no normal meals, no certain rescue, no easy way to send word to anyone, and no clear path back. It is a difficult thing to imagine from a comfortable room. Most of us become mildly distressed when the kettle takes too long, when the internet slows down, or when we cannot find the right charger. Shackleton's men had to deal with a ship crushed by ice, months of drifting, sleeping on frozen floes, crossing stormy seas in small open boats, and somehow continuing to believe that survival was still possible. If you find this kind of journey soothing, interesting, or simply a useful way to let your mind settle at the end of a long day, I would be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like and perhaps subscribed. It helps this little corner of calm reach more people who enjoy history told slowly, gently, and with enough room to breathe. And if you're already settled in, then there is no need to hurry. The ice certainly will not. Antarctica has never been known for rushing to make anyone's life easier, so make yourself comfortable. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let the day loosen its grip. Tonight, we're not racing across the ice. We're moving at the pace of a wooden ship pushing south through fog, snow and black water. We are following a group of men who did not know, when they first set out, just how far endurance could truly stretch, and that word, endurance, was not only the name painted on their ship. By the time the story was over, it had become almost a description of the men themselves. The expedition began in an age when polar exploration still carried a strange hold over the public imagination. Antarctica was not merely a place on a map. It was a challenge, a blank white space that seemed to ask what human beings could bear. By the early 20th century, explorers had already raced toward the South Pole. Roald Amundsen had reached it first in 1911. Robert Falcon Scott had reached it soon after, only to die with his men on the return journey. These stories had made Antarctica famous but not familiar. It remained distant, dangerous, and stubbornly unwilling to be conquered in any ordinary sense. Ernest Shackleton knew this world better than most. He had already been south before. He had felt the cold, seen the wide emptiness, and learned that Antarctica did not care about ambition. It did not care about flags, newspaper headlines, or speeches given in warm rooms by people who had never tried to sleep while their breath froze above their blankets. Shackleton had come close to the South Pole on an earlier expedition, closer than anyone before him at that time, but he had turned back when supplies ran low. That decision may have cost him a grand prize, but it saved lives, and that matters, because the story of the Endurance is not really the story of a man chasing glory at any cost. It is the story of a man who, when everything went wrong, decided that the only success left was to bring every one of his men home alive. His new plan was bold, and in the plainest possible terms, extremely difficult. Shackleton wanted to cross Antarctica from one side to the other, passing through the South Pole along the way. Since the pole itself had already been reached, this crossing would be the next great achievement. It would mean landing on the coast of the Weddell Sea, marching across the continent, and eventually reaching the Ross Sea on the far side, where another party would lay supply depots to help complete the journey. On paper, it had a clean line to it. Start here, cross there, finish over there. Maps have a way of making terrible ideas look tidy. The ship chosen for Shackleton's side of the expedition was the Endurance, a strong wooden vessel built for polar conditions. She was not large by modern standards, but she was sturdy, elegant, and made with serious care. Her hull was built to resist pressure from ice, though there are limits to what any wooden ship can survive when the sea itself decides to become a slow-moving vice. At the start, however, she looked capable, she looked prepared, she looked like the sort of ship that could carry men into danger and bring them back again. Ships often look very confident before they meet Antarctica. The men who joined Shackleton were a mixture of sailors, scientists, officers, and specialists, each bringing a different skill and a different temperament. There were experienced seamen, a photographer, a surgeon, a carpenter, a cook, and men who had handled dogs and equipment. Some were tough and practical, some were young and eager, some had already seen hard service at sea. Others were drawn by adventure, duty, curiosity, or the simple fact that an ordinary life did not quite suit them. One of the famous lines connected with the expedition says that Shackleton placed an advertisement warning of low wages, bitter cold, long months of darkness, constant danger, and doubtful safe return. Whether that exact advertisement truly appeared in that form is debated, but it captures the mood rather well. It was not the sort of job one accepted for comfort. There is something quietly remarkable about those 28 men when you think of them not as names in a history book, but as living people packing their belongings and stepping aboard. They did not set out to become a survival story. They expected hardship, certainly, but hardship with a plan. They expected to sail south, land a shore party, cross the continent, and return with a place in exploration history. They did not expect to spend months watching their ship locked in ice, unable to move. They did not expect to abandon her. They did not expect to live on drifting ice floes with the sea opening beneath them. They did not expect to row and sail through some of the worst waters on Earth in small boats that looked painfully fragile against the scale of the Southern Ocean. Most people, when they leave home, do not imagine that every ordinary comfort in their life is quietly waving goodbye. As the Endurance sailed south, the world behind the men was changing quickly. The First World War had begun in Europe, and by the time Shackleton's expedition was underway, millions of people were being pulled into a conflict that would reshape nations. Shackleton had even offered his ship and men for service, but the expedition was allowed to continue. So while armies moved across Europe, the Endurance moved toward ice. It is strange to think of these two forms of danger happening at the same time, one made by human hands, the other waiting silently at the bottom of the world. The men aboard the Endurance were leaving a world at war and entering a world that had no interest in human wars at all. Antarctica is often described as empty, but empty is not quite the right word. It is full of things that do not comfort us. Wind, ice, distance, silence, cold water, long dark. It is full of forces that do not need to be dramatic to be deadly. A small mistake can matter. A wet glove can matter. A crack in the ice can matter. A change in weather can decide whether a journey continues or ends. The landscape does not attack in the way a storybook monster attacks. It simply remains itself, and that is usually enough. For Shackleton's men, the danger began not with a single disaster, but with delay. This is often how real trouble starts, not with thunder and a dramatic announcement, but with something that seems manageable at first. The ice was heavy in the Weddell Sea that season, heavier than expected. The Endurance pushed through leads when she could, waited when she had to, and continued south with growing difficulty. There were seals on the ice, penguins watching with the solemn confusion penguins often seem to carry, and wide stretches of frozen pressure ridges that made the sea look like a broken white field. The ship moved through this world slowly, with effort, sometimes gaining only a little distance after much labour. At first, being slowed by ice was not the same as being doomed. Polar sailors understood delays, ice changes, opens, closes, shifts, and sometimes releases what it had held. The men worked, observed, kept routines, cared for the dogs, and continued to hope for progress. The Endurance was still their home. Her cabins, decks, stores, and familiar sounds gave structure to the days. A ship at sea is never just wood, rope, metal, and canvas. For the people aboard, it becomes a small floating town, a workplace, shelter, dining room, bedroom, and emotional anchor all at once. Losing movement is worrying. Losing the ship itself is something else entirely. One of the most important things to understand about this expedition is that survival did not come from one great heroic act. It came from hundreds of small decisions made over and over again. Keeping routines, maintaining discipline, saving supplies, managing moods, watching the ice, caring for the sick, repairing what could be repaired, making meals out of what was available, keeping men busy enough not to sink into fear. This may sound less dramatic than a single grand moment, but it is often the real work of survival. A person can be brave for a minute. Staying steady for months is harder. Shackleton had a particular gift for understanding morale. He knew that men could survive hunger and cold for a time, but hopelessness was more dangerous. He watched personalities carefully. He noticed who was discouraged, who was angry, who might spread fear, and who needed responsibility. He was not perfect, and no leader in such conditions could be, but he understood that command was not only about giving orders, it was about shaping the emotional weather of the group. In Antarctica, the weather outside was bad enough. He could not allow the weather inside the men to become worse. There is a reason this story continues to be told more than a century later. It is not because the expedition achieved its original goal. It did not. The men never crossed Antarctica. They never even set foot on the continental land where their planned march was meant to begin. By the standards of the mission written down before departure, the expedition failed. And yet, by another standard, a deeper and more human one, it became one of the most astonishing survival stories ever recorded. Every man who sailed on the Endurance survived, in a place that had taken many lives. Through a sequence of disasters that could easily have ended differently, not one of the 28 was lost. That fact can sound simple when stated quickly, but it should not be allowed to pass too quickly. Every man survived. The officers and sailors, the scientists and specialists, the cook, the carpenter, the photographer whose images would later help the world see what they endured. The men who were cheerful, the men who were difficult, the men who were strong, the men who grew weak, the men who doubted, the men who kept going because everyone else was still going. In survival stories, numbers can become smooth and distant. 28 men, 500 days, 1 ship, 3 boats. But each number was made of human moments, cold fingers, empty stomachs, damp clothing, quiet fears, private memories of home, the effort to sleep when the ice was cracking nearby, the effort to wake up and do it all again. It also helps to remember that these men did not have modern rescue systems, no satellite phones, no GPS, no helicopters waiting over the horizon, no emergency beacon blinking patiently into space. Once they were trapped, they were truly far from help. Their world became whatever they could see, carry, repair, eat, burn, or sail. Today, when we hear that someone is lost, we often imagine search teams, aircraft, radios, tracking devices, and weather reports. Shackleton's men had skill, judgment, endurance, and luck. Luck, by the way, should never be treated as a small thing. It is not a plan, but many survival stories are built partly from it. The cold itself was only one part of the challenge. There was also uncertainty, which can be just as exhausting. A person can bear hardship more easily when they know how long it will last. 3 days, 2 weeks, 1 month. But the men of the Endurance did not know. They could not mark a calendar and say, "Here is the date when rescue comes." They could not promise themselves that the ice would open tomorrow, or that the weather would improve next week, or that anyone outside their small group knew exactly where they were. Uncertainty stretches the mind. It makes every plan feel temporary. It turns hope into something that must be remade daily, like a fire that keeps needing fuel. Food became a constant concern. Warmth became a constant concern. The condition of the ice became a constant concern. And yet life still had to contain ordinary things. Men still talked, argued, laughed, repaired clothing, cared for animals, prepared meals, took photographs, recorded observations, and found ways to pass the time. That is another strange feature of extreme situations. The extraordinary and the ordinary sit side by side. One moment, you're wondering whether the ice beneath you will break. The next, you're thinking about dinner, or a missing glove, or whether someone has been snoring too loudly. Human beings bring everyday life with them almost anywhere, even to a drifting camp in the Weddell Sea. And then there was the ship herself. The Endurance is remembered almost like a character in the story, and for good reason. Her fate was slow and painful to watch. She did not vanish in one quick storm. She was gripped by ice, held, squeezed, damaged, and finally crushed. Imagine living aboard your only shelter, while knowing that the pressure around it is increasing. Imagine hearing timbers strain. Imagine seeing the place that was meant to carry you home slowly become unsafe beneath your feet. There is something deeply unsettling about a ship dying in ice. At sea, a ship is security. When that security begins to fail, the whole world feels less certain. Still, the men did not fall apart. That is not to say they felt no fear. Of course they did. Courage does not mean fear politely leaves the room. It means people continue to act while fear sits there making unhelpful suggestions. Shackleton and his crew salvaged what they could, prepared camps on the ice, and adjusted to a new reality that no one would have chosen. Their expedition had become something else, no longer a crossing, no longer a race for achievement. It was now a long, difficult problem with one goal only: live. Tonight, as we move through their story, we will follow that change slowly. We will see the ambition that brought them south, the early confidence of the voyage, the first signs that the ice was becoming too heavy, the months of waiting as the ship drifted helplessly, and the moment the Endurance could no longer be saved. We will stay with the men on the ice as they built routines in a place where nothing was stable. We will follow them into the lifeboats, across freezing seas toward Elephant Island, a name that may sound almost cheerful until you remember that it was a bleak, remote place, with no passing traffic and no easy rescue. And then we will follow Shackleton and 5 others as they set out in the James Caird, a small boat on a huge ocean, towards South Georgia, because someone had to go for help and there was no one else to send. It is a story that can sound impossible when compressed into a few lines. Ship trapped, ship crushed, men camp on ice, men sail open boats, men reach island, Shackleton crosses ocean, Shackleton crosses mountains, rescue returns, everyone lives. But the true weight of it is in the details, the waiting, the cold, the decisions, the distance, the way a man keeps another man alive, not only by giving him food, but by giving him a reason to believe that food will matter. So let us begin not at the worst moment, not with the ship breaking or the men stranded, but with the dream that came before it. Because every survival story starts before survival is needed. It starts with plans, maps, sponsors, packing lists, speeches, and people imagining that they understand the risk. It starts in rooms far from the ice, where Antarctica is still a line on paper and not yet a pressure around the hull. It starts with Ernest Shackleton, a man who had already met the frozen South and, for reasons both practical and personal, decided to return. Ernest Shackleton had already stood close enough to the South Pole to feel both its pull and its refusal. Years before the Endurance sailed, he had led the Nimrod expedition and come within about 97 miles of the pole, which is close enough to sound almost unbearable when you say it aloud. 97 miles. In ordinary life, that might be a long drive, a few hours with a flask of tea, a packet of biscuits, and someone in the passenger seat insisting that they know a better route. In Antarctica, it was a wall of hunger, cold, exhaustion, and danger. Shackleton turned back. He had food running low, men weakening, and no sensible way to continue without risking all their lives. It was a bitter decision, but it was also the kind of decision that tells you something important about him. He wanted glory, certainly. He wanted achievement. He wanted his name connected to the last great blank spaces on the map. But when the choice became the pole or the lives of his men, he chose the men. That choice followed him. It gave him credibility, but it also left something unfinished. The South Pole had not been reached by him, and soon enough it would be reached by someone else. In December 1911, Roald Amundsen and his Norwegian team arrived at the pole after a carefully planned journey that used dogs, skis, and cold practical judgment with very little room for romance. A few weeks later, Robert Falcon Scott and his British party reached the same place, only to find Amundsen's flag already there. Scott and his companions died on the return journey, and the story became one of the most famous tragedies in exploration. Britain mourned Scott as a hero. Amundsen had won the race, but Scott's death filled newspapers, speeches, and public memory with the terrible cost of the attempt. For Shackleton, this changed everything. The great race to the pole was over. There was no longer any point in trying to become first to stand there. That prize had been taken, and in the world of exploration, where sponsors, newspapers, and governments liked clean achievements, second place had very little sparkle. You could not exactly sell an expedition by saying, "We shall go to the place someone else already reached, and we may be colder while doing it." Shackleton needed a new goal, something bold enough to capture attention and difficult enough to feel worthy of the risks. Antarctica still had one great challenge left, at least in the eyes of the age. It had been touched at the pole, but it had not been crossed from sea to sea. The idea was simple when described from the comfort of a chair, which is how many difficult ideas become dangerous. Shackleton would land a party on the coast of the Weddell Sea on one side of Antarctica. From there, he and a small group would travel inland, cross the South Pole, and continue all the way to the Ross Sea on the other side. In total, the planned route would cover roughly 1,800 miles across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. It would not only be a journey to the pole, it would be a full crossing of the continent, a line drawn across the bottom of the world, made not with ink, but with sledges, dogs, frostbitten hands, and a great deal of stubbornness. To make this possible, Shackleton's expedition had to be split into two main parts. His own group, the Weddell Sea Party, would sail aboard the Endurance and attempt to land near Vassal Bay. From there, the crossing party would begin the long march. On the opposite side of Antarctica, another group, the Ross Sea Party, would sail aboard a different ship, the Aurora. Their task was less famous but absolutely essential. They were to lay supply depots inland from the Ross Sea, so that when Shackleton's crossing party came down from the pole and moved toward the far coast, they would find food and fuel waiting for them. Without those depots, the second half of the crossing would be nearly impossible. It is easy to remember the men on the Endurance because their survival story became so famous. But the Ross Sea Party also suffered greatly, and their work was dangerous, exhausting, and in some cases deadly. Even before the Endurance became trapped, the whole expedition depended on people separated by an entire continent, each group trusting the other to do its part. That trust is worth pausing over. Today we are used to updates, tracking, messages, and the small comfort of knowing that someone has received our note, even if they rudely leave it unanswered while clearly being online. Shackleton's expedition had none of that. Once the two ships separated into their different missions, communication would be extremely limited or impossible for long periods. Shackleton could not simply check whether the depots had been laid. The Ross Sea Party could not check whether Shackleton had managed to land on the Weddell Sea coast. Each side had to proceed as if the other side was succeeding. That is a very particular kind of pressure, the kind that sits quietly in the background and makes every decision heavier. Planning such an expedition required money, and money, unlike courage, does not usually appear just because a person has a grand idea. Shackleton had to raise funds from private backers, public supporters, and anyone who could be persuaded that crossing Antarctica was worth paying for. He gave lectures, appealed to patriotic feeling, made promises about scientific value and national prestige, and worked hard to present the expedition as the next great British polar achievement. Exploration at that time was not only about science, it was also about reputation. Nations cared about flags, firsts, maps, and stories that could make people feel proud over breakfast while reading the newspaper. Antarctica was remote, but it was also useful as a stage on which ambition could be performed. Shackleton was good at this part. He had charm, energy, and the ability to make people believe in a plan that may have sounded unreasonable if spoken by anyone less convincing. He could talk about danger without making it seem hopeless. He could talk about hardship while still making it sound noble. He understood the power of a clear objective. Crossing Antarctica sounded grand, easy to remember, and difficult to dismiss. It was not a small scientific survey or a modest coastal journey. It was the last great Antarctic crossing, the kind of phrase that looks very impressive in a newspaper and very cold in practice. The expedition was given the formal name of the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. It was a title with plenty of weight in it, the kind of title that seems to arrive wearing boots and a serious expression. Imperial reflected the British Empire and the age in which the expedition was planned. Trans-Antarctic described the intended crossing. Expedition made the whole thing sound organised, which it was, though organisation in Antarctica is rather like bringing a neat notebook to a snowstorm. Useful, yes, but not always in charge. The Endurance herself became central to the plan. She had originally been built in Norway and was first named Polaris. She was designed for polar work, with a strong hull and careful construction. Shackleton purchased her for his expedition and renamed her Endurance, after his family motto, "By endurance we conquer." That motto feels almost too perfect now, as if history quietly leaned over and chose the name in advance. At the time, it was simply fitting. Shackleton admired persistence. He believed that hardship could be overcome through discipline, morale, and steady effort. The ship's name carried that belief southward, painted on her stern, while the men aboard still imagined that endurance would mean crossing ice on foot, not waiting for a ship to be crushed beneath them. The men who joined him came from different backgrounds, and Shackleton chose them not only for technical skill, but for character. This mattered. In polar travel, a man who is skilled but unpleasant can become a serious problem. A person who complains constantly, panics easily, refuses teamwork, or poisons morale may be more dangerous than a shortage of biscuits, and that is not a sentence to be used lightly. Shackleton understood that a small group trapped together in extreme conditions would need more than ability. They would need patience, humour, loyalty, and the capacity to live closely with others, without turning every minor irritation into a crisis. There were officers with sea experience, men such as Frank Worsley, who became captain of the Endurance and whose navigation later proved vital. Worsley had the instincts of a skilled sailor, the kind of person who could read the sea with a seriousness most of us reserve for reading restaurant menus. There was Frank Wild, Shackleton's trusted second in command, a tough and experienced polar man who had served with him before. Wild was steady, practical, and deeply dependable, which in a survival situation is about as useful as a warm stove and dry socks. There was also Tom Crean, another experienced Antarctic hand, strong, resilient, and already known for extraordinary endurance. There was Harry McNish, the carpenter, whose skills would become essential when the men later had to strengthen and adapt the lifeboats. There was Charles Green, the cook, who would have the unenviable job of producing meals under conditions that would make most kitchens file a formal complaint. There was Frank Hurley, the photographer, whose images would become some of the most famous photographs in polar history. Hurley was bold and determined, sometimes to a degree that must have tested everyone's nerves, but without him we would not see the story as clearly as we do now. His photographs of the Endurance caught in ice, lit by strange light, surrounded by pressure ridges and darkness, remain some of the most haunting records of exploration ever made. There were scientists too, because the expedition was not meant to be only a feat of travel. Shackleton intended to collect geographical, geological, meteorological and biological information. The Antarctic was still poorly understood by Europeans, and every expedition carried the promise of new knowledge. There were plans to study weather, map unknown coastlines, examine ice conditions, collect specimens, and observe the natural world. This was serious work, though one suspects that the penguins did not feel especially honoured to be scientifically observed. They had, after all, been managing Antarctica quite well without human commentary. The crew also included men responsible for the dogs, which were expected to help haul sledges across the ice. Dogs had become an important part of polar travel, especially after Amundsen's success. They could move loads over snow and ice more efficiently than men alone, though they also required food, care, training, and constant attention. On the Endurance, the dogs were not just equipment. They had names, habits, personalities, and in time became companions. The bond between humans and animals in extreme places can become very strong, partly because animals do not discuss strategy at length when everyone is tired. They simply need feeding, care, and direction, which can be oddly grounding when the larger situation becomes uncertain. Recruitment for the expedition has often been surrounded by the famous advertisement supposedly placed by Shackleton, reading something like, "Men wanted for hazardous journey. Small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return, doubtful, honour and recognition in case of success." It is a wonderful piece of writing, so good that it almost sounds suspicious, and historians have questioned whether the advertisement appeared exactly as later legend claimed. Still, whether or not those precise words were printed, they capture the appeal of the expedition. It was dangerous, uncomfortable, badly paid compared with the risk, and likely to produce hardship in generous quantities. Naturally, many men wanted to go. Human beings are a strange species, offer us comfort and we grow restless. Offer us frostbite, hunger and a chance to be remembered, and someone will start packing a suitcase. Shackleton reportedly received many applications. He had to choose carefully, though his methods could be unusual. He valued instinct. He looked for men who could get along with others, who had useful skills, and who would not crumble under pressure. In the end, the selected men formed a shipboard community that would be tested far beyond what any interview could reveal. It is one thing to seem cheerful in an office. It is another to remain bearable after months on ice, eating reduced rations, wearing damp clothes, and listening to the same handful of people breathe, chew, joke, and grumble every day. A polar expedition is, among other things, a very long group project with no option to quit. The broader timing of the expedition was difficult. Europe was moving toward war, and by August 1914, as Shackleton prepared to sail, the First World War had begun. It would have been understandable for the expedition to be cancelled or postponed. Shackleton offered the ship, stores and men to the British government for the war effort, but he was told to proceed. And so, while millions of soldiers and civilians were being drawn into a conflict of enormous scale, the Endurance continued toward the far south. There is something almost unreal about that contrast. On one side of the world, trenches, artillery, armies, and the machinery of modern war. On the other, a wooden ship moving toward ice, carrying men who were about to fight a different kind of battle, not against an enemy, but against distance, cold, and time. The expedition first sailed from Britain to Buenos Aires, and from there the Endurance made her way to South Georgia, an island in the South Atlantic that served as an important whaling station. South Georgia was remote, but compared with Antarctica, it was almost bustling. There were whalers there, men who knew the southern seas, men who understood ice and weather not as dramatic ideas, but as daily working facts. Their knowledge mattered. Some warned Shackleton that the ice in the Weddell Sea was especially heavy that season. Heavy ice was not a small inconvenience. It could delay a ship, trap it, damage it, or make landing impossible. Warnings like that are difficult things. When you have raised money, gathered men, bought a ship, packed stores, made public promises, and sailed across the world, a warning can feel less like advice and more like a door closing in your face. Shackleton listened, but he also decided to go on. This decision has been debated ever since. Was it reckless? Was it understandable? Was it simply the kind of risk polar explorers had to take if they were to accomplish anything at all? The answer is not perfectly simple. The ice was worse than expected, and the consequences were enormous. At the same time, expedition leaders often had to act with incomplete information. If every warning had stopped every voyage, much of exploration history would be a very short pamphlet. The dream still seemed possible when the Endurance left South Georgia in December 1914. The ship carried men, dogs, stores, scientific equipment, sledges, clothing, fuel, tents, and the many practical items needed for an Antarctic crossing. On board were hopes that had been packed just as carefully, though they were more fragile. The men hoped for success, recognition, adventure, and safe return. Some may have hoped for personal proof of courage, some for escape from ordinary life, some for the satisfaction of doing something difficult and useful. Shackleton hoped to lead the first crossing of Antarctica and secure his place in the history of exploration. None of these hopes were foolish. They belonged to the expedition they believed they were undertaking. As the ship moved farther south, the world changed. The sea grew colder. Ice appeared more often. The air sharpened. The days became stranger in their light. The ordinary rhythms of land fell away. A ship entering polar waters does not cross a visible border with a sign politely saying, "Antarctica begins here. Please dress warmly." Instead, the change comes gradually. More ice in the water, more cold in the wind, more silence between signs of life. The men would have seen icebergs, floes, and seabirds. They would have felt the motion of the ship and heard the sounds of work on deck. They would have known that they were approaching the edge of the real test. At this stage, the dream of crossing Antarctica was still alive. It had not yet been broken by pressure ice. The plan still existed in its full shape: land in the Weddell Sea, establish a base, prepare sledges and dogs, march inland, cross the pole, find the depots laid by the Ross Sea Party, reach the far coast. Return as the men who had completed the last great Antarctic journey. It was an enormous plan, but plans can remain very convincing until the physical world begins offering corrections. For Shackleton, the dream was tied to more than personal ambition. It was tied to the public idea of endurance, courage, and national achievement. It was tied to his past, to the earlier turning back near the pole, to the sense that he still had unfinished work in the south. It was tied to the men who trusted him, and that last part would become the most important. At the beginning, the men were following him toward a goal. Later, they would be following him away from disaster. A leader may set out to make history, but history may ask him to do something much harder and much less glamorous. It may ask him to keep people alive after the dream has failed. That is one of the quiet truths of the endurance story. The original ambition did not survive. The crossing was never completed. The map line was never walked. The planned glory never happened. Yet the dream mattered because it brought the men together, carried them south, and placed them in the situation that would reveal what they were made of. It gave the story its beginning, even though the story would become famous for something else entirely. Sometimes a failed plan becomes the doorway into a greater test, not a better test, certainly not a kinder one, but a test that shows character more clearly than success might have done. The Endurance did not sail south as a doomed ship in the minds of those aboard her. She sailed as a working vessel on a serious mission. Men joked, worked, ate, slept, argued, and made themselves useful. Dogs barked. Equipment was checked. The sea rolled under the hull. The cold increased. Shackleton watched conditions and made decisions. Worsley handled the ship. Hurley prepared his cameras. Scientists looked outward with interest. Sailors did the endless jobs sailors do, many of which involve ropes, damp clothing, and trying not to be thrown about at inconvenient moments. Life aboard had not yet narrowed into survival. It was still expedition life, disciplined and uncomfortable, but purposeful. Purpose is powerful. It gives hardship a reason. Cold can be endured if it is part of progress. Hunger can be endured if it seems temporary. Danger can be endured if it belongs to a goal everyone understands. The men of the Endurance still had that. They were not yet lost. They were not yet stranded. Each mile south still seemed like part of the planned journey. Each obstacle was still something to get through on the way to the crossing. The ice was difficult, but difficulty had been expected. It is only later, when difficulty refuses to end, that people begin to understand they have entered a different kind of story. The Weddell Sea was waiting with heavy ice. Pack ice does not behave like a simple solid sheet. It shifts, opens, closes, drifts, and grinds under the influence of wind, current, and pressure. Leads of open water may appear and then vanish. A path may seem possible in the morning and be sealed by afternoon. A ship can be surrounded slowly, almost politely, until movement becomes impossible. This was the danger ahead. Not a single dramatic wave, not one sudden crash, but a slow tightening. A trap made of weather, ocean, and frozen pressure. Still, the men could not know exactly what would happen. None of us can, really, which is perhaps why stories like this hold our attention. We see the ship sailing onward, and we know more than they did. We know the plan will fail. We know the Endurance will be trapped. We know the crossing will never begin. But they did not know that. To them, the dream was still ahead, white, difficult, and waiting. They were still explorers moving toward a continent. They were still men with a destination, a schedule, and a ship beneath their feet. And so the Endurance moved deeper into the ice, carrying with her the full weight of Shackleton's ambition and the practical hopes of everyone aboard. Behind them lay South Georgia, the last outpost of human industry they would see for a very long time. Ahead lay the Weddell Sea, crowded with ice earlier and thicker than they had hoped. The dream of crossing Antarctica had not ended. Not yet. It was simply beginning to meet the place where dreams are tested most severely, not in speeches or maps or newspaper announcements, but in the slow push of a wooden hull against a frozen sea. When the Endurance left South Georgia, she was leaving more than a whaling station behind. She was leaving the last solid link to the ordinary world. South Georgia was remote, rugged, and hardly anyone's idea of comfort, unless that person had a very unusual affection for freezing winds, whale oil, and hard work before breakfast. but compared with what lay ahead, it was still a place of people, buildings, smoke, voices, tools, messages and news from elsewhere. It was still connected to the human world. Once the Endurance sailed away from it, the men were moving into a region where help could no longer be counted on, where even turning back might not be simple, and where the sea itself was beginning to change its mind about remaining water. The ship departed from Grytviken, South Georgia, on December the 5th, 1914. The timing was important. In the southern hemisphere, this was the beginning of the Antarctic summer, the season when the ice might be at its most open, and the chances of reaching the continent were better. Better, of course, does not mean good. Antarctica is not generous simply because the calendar has become slightly more polite. Summer in the far south can still mean gales, snow, freezing spray, dangerous seas, and ice waiting in large, unfriendly quantities. But this was the season Shackleton had to use. If the Endurance could push through the Weddell Sea and reach the coast, the shore party could begin the work of establishing a base and preparing for the crossing. The warnings from the whalers at South Georgia were still fresh. Men who knew those waters had told Shackleton that the ice was unusually heavy. They had seen conditions that suggested the Weddell Sea would be difficult, perhaps more difficult than expected. Whalers were practical people. They were not sitting by the fire inventing dramatic tales to impress passing explorers. Their work depended on knowing ice, weather and sea conditions, and when such men gave warnings, they deserved attention. Shackleton did pay attention, but he also believed there might still be a route through. Expedition leaders often live in that narrow space between caution and commitment. Too much caution, and no great journey ever begins. Too much commitment, and a ship may sail willingly into a trap. At the time, Shackleton could not know exactly where that line would fall. The Endurance headed south into cold seas and increasingly scattered ice. At first, the ice appeared in manageable forms. There were bergs and floes, white shapes drifting on the dark water, sometimes beautiful, sometimes inconvenient, sometimes both. The ship could work around them, thread through openings and make progress. Men aboard polar ships learned to read these conditions carefully. Ice was not just ice. There was young ice, old ice, loose ice, heavy pack, pressure ridges, floes of different thickness, leads of open water, and places where the sea looked passable until it very much did not. To an inexperienced eye, the view might seem like one endless white complication. To sailors and polar men, each shape carried information. As the Endurance moved farther from South Georgia, the air grew sharper, and the sea began to fill with signs of the world ahead. Birds followed or passed by. Icebergs appeared in strange forms. Some rose like walls, some looked like broken towers, others sat low and wide, with blue shadows in their cracks and undersides. The water around them could be calm one moment and restless the next. Icebergs can look still and peaceful, but that is only because they are very large and have no need to hurry. They can roll, split, drift, and crush without warning. A wooden ship treated them with respect. Life aboard continued with routine because routine is one of the ways sailors keep a voyage from becoming only weather and worry. Watches had to be kept. Meals had to be prepared. The dogs had to be fed and managed. Equipment needed checking. Scientific observations continued where possible. The ship itself required constant care. Salt, ice, damp, cold, and motion all work patiently against a vessel. Ropes stiffen, decks freeze. Metal bites the hand. Clothing stays damp if not carefully dried. A small problem ignored at sea can grow into a large problem with impressive speed, rather like a rumour in a village, though usually with more frost involved. The dogs were a lively presence aboard. They had been brought for the intended sledging journey across Antarctica, and they were housed in kennels on deck. Managing them at sea was not easy. Dogs bred and trained for polar work were strong, noisy, energetic, and not always inclined toward calm reflection. They fought, pulled, barked, and made daily work more complicated. Yet they also brought life to the ship. In a place where the landscape was becoming more severe, animals gave the men something warm, immediate and familiar to care for. Feeding a dog, calming it, checking its condition, or laughing at its behaviour could pull a man's attention away from the larger uncertainties for a few minutes. That sort of thing matters more than it may sound. Frank Hurley, the photographer, was also busy. He understood that the expedition needed a visual record, and he worked with large cameras and glass plates under conditions that were rarely convenient. Photography in the Antarctic was not a matter of quickly lifting a phone and taking a picture of something impressive before deciding the lighting was not quite right. Cameras were heavy, plates were fragile, exposure required care, cold affected materials and fingers alike. Hurley had to think about light, movement, equipment, and survival all at once. His work would later become one of the reasons the Endurance story feels so immediate. We can still see the ship in the ice, the men, the dogs, the pressure ridges, and the strange scale of the place. Without those images, the story would remain powerful, but it would feel farther away. The Endurance continued south through the Scotia Sea and toward the Weddell Sea, a region already known for difficult ice. The Weddell Sea is partly enclosed by the Antarctic Peninsula and the coast of the continent, and its pack ice can be dense and unpredictable. Winds and currents move ice around in ways that can create sudden barriers. A ship may find a lead of open water, follow it hopefully, and then discover that it narrows, twists, or closes. It is rather like being invited down a corridor by someone who then quietly builds a wall behind you. Not ideal behaviour from a sea, but the Weddell Sea has never seemed overly concerned with manners. Soon, the ship began meeting heavier pack. Progress slowed. Sometimes the Endurance could push through loose ice, her reinforced hull nudging floes aside or riding against them with steady pressure. Other times the men had to wait for openings, or work the ship along leads, or stop while the pack tightened. The sound of ice against a wooden hull is not a small thing. There is scraping, grinding, knocking, and the deeper pressure of a large mass is shifting. A ship speaks in such moments, through creaks and shudders, and the men aboard learn to listen. Some sounds are ordinary, others are warnings. None are especially helpful for relaxed sleeping. Still, the mood aboard did not collapse. This was polar work. Difficult ice had been expected, even if the amount of it was troubling. Shackleton and Worsley pressed on when they could. They studied conditions, chose routes, and looked for any opening that might carry them nearer to the Antarctic coast. The ship was not yet trapped, and that distinction mattered. A moving ship, however slow, still gives hope. Every mile gained suggests the plan is still alive. Every lead of open water feels like an invitation. Every stretch of heavy pack feels like a test that may pass. The men also had the daily business of adjusting to cold. Antarctic cold is not simply a number on a thermometer. It changes how every task feels. Touching metal carelessly can hurt. Wet fabric becomes dangerous. Breath freezes. Beards gather ice. Hands lose skill. A simple job may require gloves, patience, and a willingness to do it again when the first attempt fails because a rope is frozen stiff or a latch refuses to behave. Cooking becomes harder. Sleeping becomes less restful. Getting dressed becomes an event, which is rarely what one wants first thing in the morning. Yet there was also beauty, and the men noticed it. Polar accounts are full of hardship, but they are also full of descriptions of light, ice, sky, and sea. The Antarctic can be terrifying and beautiful at the same time, which is inconvenient from a practical point of view, but very effective for memory. The sun could shine low over the ice, turning ridges gold or pink. Icebergs could glow blue from within. The sea could appear black and polished between floes. Penguins sometimes stood on the ice and watched the ship pass, looking as though they had formed a small committee to discuss whether humans were a wise development. Seals rested on floes, large and calm, unaware that they might later become part of the expedition's food supply. Nature in such places is not there to decorate the human story, but humans cannot help noticing it. The deeper the Endurance went, the more the ice controlled the pace. This is one of the great shifts in polar travel by ship. At first, a captain commands the vessel, the engine turns, sails may help, and the ship follows human intention. But in heavy pack, command becomes negotiation. The ship can try this lead, avoid that pressure, wait for this opening, reverse from that obstacle, or push carefully through loose floes. But the ice decides the larger terms. It can open a path or close one. It can let the ship advance or hold it still. It can drift with wind and current, carrying the ship in a direction no one asked for. A captain remains important, but the sea has joined the conversation, and it is not a quiet participant. By late December, the Endurance was pushing through increasingly troublesome ice. The men were still hoping to reach Vassal Bay, where they intended to land. The date mattered because the season was moving on. Every delay reduced the time available for landing stores, setting up a base and preparing the crossing. Antarctic seasons do not pause for optimism. Summer would not last indefinitely. The men needed open water, or at least workable ice conditions, but the pack kept making progress slow and uncertain. There were moments when the Endurance seemed to find her way. Leads opened and she made distance. Spirits would lift. A little progress could make the whole ship feel lighter. Then the ice would thicken again, or the weather would change, or a promising route would close. This pattern can be mentally exhausting. It gives hope and removes it, gives hope and removes it again. A person can almost settle into a difficult situation if it is consistent, but uncertainty keeps tugging at the nerves. It says, maybe today. Then it says, not today. Then, just when everyone is tired of listening, it says, perhaps tomorrow. Very rude. Uncertainty. It has poor timing and no respect for morale. Shackleton had to manage both navigation and expectation. He could not allow the men to feel defeated while there was still work to do, nor could he pretend that everything was easy. Good leadership in such conditions often means holding two truths at once. The situation is serious, and we are still capable of acting. That balance is difficult. Too much cheerfulness can sound false. Too much grim honesty can drain strength. Shackleton's style at its best found practical confidence. He did not need the men to believe that Antarctica was friendly. He needed them to believe that he was watching, deciding, and still leading. Frank Worsley's role was also critical. Navigating in polar waters required skill and patience. Cloud, fog, snow, ice, and uncertain visibility could make position difficult to confirm. Magnetic compasses become less reliable near polar regions, and even when navigation was possible, the shifting ice could complicate everything. A ship trapped or slowed in pack might drift while appearing to be still. Open water could carry them one way, ice another. Worsley had to keep track of where they were, where they needed to go, and how much the environment was quietly interfering. The engine was used to force through ice where possible, but the Endurance was not an icebreaker in the modern sense. She was strong, but she could not simply smash through anything in her path. Her hull had been built with careful reinforcement, including heavy timbers, but pressure ice is a different kind of enemy. It does not need speed. It presses slowly and with enormous force. A ship can survive being bumped, scraped, and squeezed lightly. But if the pack closes around it and the pressure builds, wood begins to complain, then bend, then break. At this stage, the danger was not yet final, but the possibility was always there. On board, the men continued their routines because stopping routine would have meant admitting that the expedition had already lost control. Meals were served, watches changed, dogs were exercised when possible, observations were taken, conversations continued. There may have been arguments, jokes, boredom, and the usual shipboard mixture of irritation and companionship. No group of men in close quarters remains noble all the time. Someone will always be too loud, too slow, too cheerful in the morning, or too convinced that his way of doing a small job is the only civilized method. Shackleton knew this, and he paid close attention to personalities. Small tensions could become large ones if left alone in cold confinement. The Antarctic environment had a way of narrowing attention. At home, a person can think about many things at once: letters, errands, meals, bills, appointments, weather, family, plans, the mysterious disappearance of a sock that was definitely in the laundry a minute ago. On the Endurance, the field of concern became more direct: ice, weather, ship, food, dogs, health, position, progress. These concerns repeated day after day, and repetition can become heavy even when nothing dramatic happens. The men had not yet reached the stage of full survival, but the pattern was beginning. Wait, work, hope, reassess, continue. In January 1915, the Endurance pushed deeper into the pack. At times, she was less than a day's sail from her intended landing area, at least in terms of distance. That is one of the cruel details of the story. They came close. Not close in a comfortable sense, not close like missing a train and catching the next one, but close enough that the failure to land must have felt especially bitter later. The Antarctic coast was not an imaginary goal somewhere beyond all reach. It was nearly there, but the ice stood between the ship and the plan. A few miles in heavy pack can become as unreachable as another planet, only with more snow and fewer helpful rockets. The ship entered a world of compacted floes and pressure. The leads became fewer. Open water became harder to find. The Endurance could move only when the ice allowed movement. Men sometimes went onto the ice to help with tasks, to inspect conditions or to work around the ship. Standing on sea ice near a trapped or slowed vessel can be strange. It may look like solid land, but it is not land. It is floating, shifting, cracking and changing. The sea lies underneath, cold and immediate. A crack can open, a floe can move. The surface underfoot can be both pathway and threat. As the Endurance struggled southward, the men may still have believed that patience would be enough. Heavy ice could delay them, but perhaps a change in wind would loosen the pack. Perhaps a lead would open. Perhaps they could still reach the coast and begin the real expedition. This hope was not foolish. Ice conditions can change suddenly. A ship trapped one day may be free the next. But the Weddell Sea was slowly becoming less like an obstacle and more like a cage. By mid-January, the situation had grown worse. The ship was increasingly beset, caught in pack ice that limited or stopped her movement. When a ship becomes beset, she is not necessarily destroyed. She is held. That can sound almost gentle, but it is not. Being held in ice means the ship is no longer fully under human control. She drifts with the pack. Her route is no longer chosen in the normal way. The crew can work, wait, and prepare, but they cannot simply point the bow toward open sea and go. The expedition's plan depends on movement, and movement is now being taken away. There is a particular frustration in being close to action, but unable to act. If the Endurance had been wrecked suddenly, the men would have known at once that the plan had changed. If they had never reached the Weddell Sea, the failure would have been clear. But being trapped in ice created a long uncertainty. The ship was still intact. The men were still alive. Stores were still aboard. The shore party still existed. The crossing still existed as an idea. Yet nothing could begin. The continent was near, but unreachable. The expedition had not ended, but it had stopped. The ice around the Endurance was not still. It moved with currents and wind, carrying the ship along helplessly. This drift would become one of the defining facts of the coming months. The men were not simply parked in one place. They were being transported by the pack slowly and unpredictably. A person standing on deck might see little change from hour to hour, just ice, ridges and sky. But the whole field was moving. The ship had become part of a frozen system far larger than itself. It is not a comforting thing to realise that your home, your transport and your entire plan are now being carried along by a force you cannot steer. At first, there remained the hope that the ice would loosen. Shackleton had reason to wait. If the pack opened, the Endurance might still continue. The men could preserve the ship, maintain order and be ready. Waiting became strategy. And waiting, as anyone who has sat in a doctor's office with an ancient magazine and a loudly ticking clock knows, can feel longer than action. But this was waiting with higher stakes. Each day of delay pushed the expedition farther from its intended schedule. Each movement of the ice could help or harm. Each creak in the hull reminded them that the ship was strong, yes, but not invincible. The Endurance was now entering the part of her story that would change her from a vessel of exploration into a shelter under siege. The men had sailed into the ice believing they would pass through it. Instead, the ice had begun to close around them. The dream of crossing Antarctica had not yet been officially abandoned, and no one could say with certainty what would happen next. But the shape of the expedition was already changing. The ship that had carried ambition southward was now caught in a white and shifting prison, and the men aboard were about to learn that in the Weddell Sea, progress could stop long before danger reached its worst. The moment a ship stops moving by choice, a voyage changes. The Endurance had not reached the Antarctic coast. She had not landed her stores, unloaded the dogs for the crossing, or placed Shackleton and his chosen party at the start of their great march. She was still out on the Weddell Sea, surrounded by pack ice, with the continent close enough to remain painfully present in everyone's thoughts. But the ship could no longer make her own way. She was held in place by ice, and from that point on, the men aboard were not so much sailing as drifting inside a frozen field. This was not quite the disaster it would later become. Not yet. The ship was still sound, the stores were still aboard, the cabins were still warm compared with the world outside, which is a low bar but a meaningful one when the alternative is sleeping on ice. The men could still eat at tables, work in familiar spaces, check equipment, tend the dogs, and move about the ship with some sense of order. They still had a roof, a stove, bunks, tools, and the heavy comfort of wooden walls around them. If the ice opened, perhaps they could continue. If the season changed favourably, perhaps the Weddell Sea would release them. That little word, perhaps, can keep a group of people going for a surprisingly long time. The Endurance became Beset in January 1915, caught in ice that tightened around her and stopped her progress. The planned landing place was not impossibly far away, but distance in pack ice does not behave like distance on a road. A few miles of ice can stop a ship more completely than 1,000 miles of open sea. The men could look at maps and know where they wanted to be, but maps do not show the strength of pressure ridges, the thickness of floes, or the quiet stubbornness of ice that has decided not to move aside. Antarctica had not defeated them with a storm or a sudden wreck. It had simply closed the door before they reached the threshold. At first, there was still work to do with the ship as a ship. The crew kept watch, maintained the engine, checked the hull, and watched for leads of open water. They were ready to take advantage of any chance. If the pack loosened, the Endurance might be worked free. Men could use poles, saws, ice anchors, and muscle to help shift small pieces of ice around the hull, but they could not move the great pack itself. It was like trying to tidy a room while the walls slowly rearrange themselves. You may feel productive for a minute, but the building is not taking your opinion seriously. Shackleton had to decide when to keep behaving as though the expedition might soon continue, and when to accept that the ship would have to winter in the ice. That was not a small decision. To winter in the pack meant admitting that the crossing could not begin that season. It meant shifting from movement to waiting, from a bold march across the continent to months of preservation. It meant reorganising the lives of 28 men around a ship that was no longer transport but shelter. The original plan had already begun to slip away, though it had not yet vanished entirely. Shackleton did not need to announce failure in dramatic terms. The ice was doing that slowly enough. By late February, he accepted the practical reality. The Endurance would be turned into a winter station. Ship routine changed. The men prepared for months locked in the ice. This kind of adjustment sounds simple when written in one sentence, but it meant a complete change in mental life. A moving expedition has an obvious purpose. Each day brings progress, or at least the attempt at progress. A trapped expedition must create purpose from maintenance, observation, discipline, and patience. Days can become shapeless if no one takes control of them. Shackleton understood this very well. He knew that boredom, worry, and idleness could damage morale as surely as cold could damage fingers. So the men built routines. They cared for the dogs. They took scientific observations. They repaired clothing and equipment. They exercised when weather allowed. They organised entertainments, games, lectures, and small rituals that made life feel less like a long delay and more like a strange floating village. Meals marked time. Watches marked time. Work marked time. In a place where the sun and ice could make days feel blurred and unreal, routine helped keep the men connected to ordinary human order. It was not glamorous, but survival rarely is. A tidy schedule can be a serious tool when the outside world has become a frozen waiting room with no receptionist. The dogs were moved onto the ice for exercise and housing, and the men built snow kennels, sometimes called dogloos, for them. The sight must have been odd and lively. A wooden ship fixed in the ice, dogs barking and pulling, men moving between the vessel and the frozen surface, and all around them miles of white pressure ridges and floes. The dogs needed food, training, and attention, even though the future of the crossing was becoming doubtful. For the handlers, this work provided structure. Animals have a way of insisting on the present moment. They do not care whether a grand continental crossing has been delayed. They care whether they are hungry, whether another dog is too close, and whether the human holding the lead is paying attention. Some of the dogs became favourites, as animals usually do. The men knew their temperaments, strengths, and mischief. In long confinement, small personalities become important. A dog that behaves badly may still lift spirits because it gives everyone something harmless to talk about. A strong team on the ice can make men imagine movement again. And a warm living creature in a frozen place can feel like an argument against despair. Of course, the dogs were also part of the expedition's practical plans. They were not pets in the modern household sense, curled on a sofa and treated as senior management. They were working animals, and their future would become one of the harder parts of the story. But during the months trapped in the Weddell Sea, they helped keep life active. The men hunted seals and penguins when possible, both for food and for fuel in the form of blubber. Fresh meat was important. It helped protect against scurvy and added variety to the stored food. Seal meat, penguin meat, sledging rations, biscuits, tinned goods, and whatever the cook could manage became part of the daily effort to keep everyone fed. Charles Green, the cook, had a difficult job. Cooking aboard a trapped polar ship was not simply a matter of producing dinner. It was morale work. A hot meal could steady a man. A warm drink could make a miserable day feel survivable. Even a small improvement in food could matter. Anyone who has ever felt restored by toast will understand this, though toast in the Weddell Sea was less a snack and more a minor act of civilization. The ship's interior became their world. The men named spaces, gathered in common areas, and made themselves as comfortable as possible. There were jokes, songs, card games, practical work, arguments, and quiet moments. They read books. They wrote in diaries. They talked about home. They listened to the pressure of ice outside. The Endurance, held fast in the pack, became a place of forced community. Privacy was scarce. Personal habits that might be ignored on land became much more noticeable. A man's laugh, cough, snoring, pessimism, cheerfulness, or method of eating could become a subject of silent study. Long confinement turns everyone into both a companion and a weather system. Shackleton watched this closely. He understood that not all danger came from outside. A group under stress can fracture. Complaints can spread, resentments can harden, Fear can become contagious if allowed to grow unchecked. He kept difficult personalities near him when needed, partly so he could manage them directly. He gave men work. He encouraged entertainment. He used routine and attention as tools of leadership. It was not enough to keep bodies alive. He had to keep the group functioning as a group. In such conditions, morale was not decoration. It was equipment. Frank Worsley continued to track the ship's position as the ice carried her along. This was an odd form of navigation because the ship was not actively sailing. The pack itself was moving, and the Endurance moved with it. Day after day, the men drifted through the Weddell Sea, sometimes in directions that helped them, sometimes in directions that did not. Their world looked nearly fixed, but their position changed. This slow drift became a kind of unwilling journey. The men had set out to cross Antarctica by land, but instead they were being carried by sea ice, with no control over the route and no clear idea when the motion would end. There is something mentally strange about drifting. When a person walks, rows, sails, or climbs, effort connects to movement. You do something, and the world changes in response. In the pack, the men could work all day and still be carried wherever the ice chose. Progress and effort were separated. That can be hard on the mind. Human beings like to feel that labour leads somewhere. We are less fond of being transported slowly by frozen ocean, while pretending not to be annoyed about it. The Antarctic winter approached. Temperatures dropped. Light changed. The sun sank lower until darkness began to dominate. The men were now facing not just delay, but the long polar night. In winter, the outside world became colder, darker, and more dangerous. Work on the ice had to be done carefully. Frostbite was a constant risk. Weather could turn quickly. The ship was often surrounded by darkness, with the sounds of ice becoming even more noticeable because there was less to see. In such conditions, imagination can become very active, which is not always helpful. A creak in the hull is rarely improved by lying awake and thinking about it for 3 hours. Still, there were moments of wonder. The Antarctic night could bring stars, moonlight, and auroras. The ice could shine under strange light. The ship could appear almost unreal, locked in the frozen sea beneath a wide, dark sky. Hurley photographed whenever he could, sometimes using flashes to capture the Endurance at night, the light bursting against ice and rigging. Those images are beautiful, but beauty did not make the situation safe. It only made it memorable. The men could admire the scene and still understand that they were trapped in it. Pressure in the ice became a growing concern. Pack ice does not simply sit around a ship like snow in a field. It moves, compresses, buckles and grinds. When wind and current drive flows together, pressure ridges rise and the ice can push against anything caught between them. The Endurance had been built strongly, but no wooden ship could ignore such force forever. The crew watched the hull, listened to the timbers, and worked to protect the vessel where possible. Sometimes the ice would squeeze and release. Sometimes the ship would lift slightly, forced upward by pressure. That was better than being crushed directly, though still not something one would request as a leisure activity. In the early months, the ship survived these pressures well enough to keep hope alive. She was strong and she had been designed for polar waters. The men could tell themselves that she might endure until spring. If the warmer season loosened the pack, perhaps they could escape. Perhaps they could still reach land. Perhaps some revised version of the expedition might continue. Hope kept changing shape. It no longer looked like a clean crossing of Antarctica on schedule. It looked like release from the ice. Then it looked like keeping the ship safe through winter. Then it would look like something smaller still. Hope often survives by reducing its demands. Life aboard during the winter required constant effort against damp, cold and monotony. Clothing had to be dried. Gear had to be maintained. The ship had to be kept livable. Coal and fuel had to be managed. Supplies had to be monitored. The men had to avoid wasting energy, but also avoid becoming inactive. Too little movement would weaken them. Too much exposure outside could injure them. It was a careful balance. The cold did not need anyone to make a large mistake. It was perfectly willing to punish small ones. The scientists continued their work where they could. Weather observations, biological notes, ice conditions, and other records still mattered. The expedition's original scientific aims had not disappeared, though survival was gradually moving to the centre of everything. Keeping records also gave men purpose. Measuring temperature, noting pressure, collecting observations and writing in journals helped turn the days into something more than waiting. Science, in that sense, became another form of order. The universe may be indifferent, but a notebook can at least put numbers in neat columns, which is sometimes the best humans can do before supper. Shackleton also encouraged activities that kept spirits from sinking. There were celebrations of birthdays and holidays, lectures, music, and games on the ice when conditions allowed. The men played football and held races. They made efforts to laugh. This may sound almost too light for such a situation, but it was serious in its own way. Laughter did not deny danger. It made danger less able to dominate every minute. A joke in a hard place is not trivial. It is a small refusal to be reduced entirely to fear. The crew's diaries from this period show a mixture of concern, routine, humour, frustration, and observation. That mixture feels very human. People rarely experience extreme situations in one emotional colour. They may be frightened in the morning, bored by afternoon, amused at dinner, and anxious again at night. A man can worry about the ship and still complain about the food. He can admire the aurora and still wish he were at home. He can trust Shackleton and still privately wonder how this will end. Survival is not a steady heroic mood. It is uneven, ordinary, and difficult, with occasional moments of courage appearing between cold toes and bad sleep. As winter deepened, the ice continued to carry the Endurance northward and westward. The planned landing on the Antarctic coast was no longer realistic for that season. The ship was moving with the pack, away from the point where the crossing was meant to begin. Shackleton had to face the fact that the expedition's original purpose was slipping out of reach, but he did not yet have to abandon the ship. As long as the Endurance remained intact, she was their best shelter and their best chance. The men could wait for the spring breakup. They could hope the ice would loosen. A trapped ship was a problem. A lost ship would be a crisis. The pressure events became more serious as time went on. Floes shoved against the hull. Ridges rose near the ship. Cracks opened and closed. Sometimes the ice around the Endurance looked like a broken landscape, with slabs piled up by pressure. Imagine a field of stone slowly moving around your house, except the stones are ice, the house is floating, and the nearest helpful neighbour is several hundred miles away and probably a seal. The scale of the force was difficult to fight because it did not behave like a single enemy. It surrounded them. It pressed from many directions. It changed without warning. The men used what tools they had to relieve pressure near the hull when possible, cutting or clearing ice, but these efforts had limits. If a small ridge threatened, men might deal with it. If the pack itself tightened, there was little they could do. The ship's fate depended increasingly on forces beyond human control. That is one of the hardest parts of the story to sit with. Skill mattered, leadership mattered, work mattered, but the ice was larger than all of them. The best they could do was respond. The Endurance endured month after month, which may have made her eventual loss even harder. She had become more than a ship. She was home. She was safety. She was the last connection to the original expedition. The men slept inside her, ate inside her, worked inside her, and trusted her. Her name must have felt reassuring, almost like a promise. But even a strong promise can be tested beyond its design. By the time the first hints of returning light and seasonal change began to matter, the men were watching for release. Spring might break the pack. The ship might yet float free. This hope was reasonable enough to hold, but not strong enough to rest on comfortably. The ice had carried them far. The hull had suffered strain. The pressure had not stopped. They were still trapped, and the coming change of season did not guarantee rescue. Sometimes melting and movement can make ice more dangerous before it becomes helpful. A frozen prison may begin to shift, and shifting walls are not always kinder than still ones. Then the pressure worsened. The ice began to attack the ship more violently, not in a single clean blow, but through repeated squeezing and twisting. The timbers groaned, planks bent. The hull was pushed and strained. Water began to enter, pumps were used. Men worked hard to save her. For a time, effort and hope continued together. They had saved the ship from difficulties before. Perhaps they could do it again. But the Weddell Sea had time, weight, and patience, which is a deeply unfair combination. Shackleton watched the situation and understood what every good leader must eventually understand. There comes a point when saving the tool can no longer matter more than saving the people. The Endurance had carried them south. She had sheltered them through the trapped months. She had kept the men alive in the Weddell Sea long after the original plan had failed. But if she became unsafe, they would have to leave her. No affection, no loyalty, and no amount of respect for a fine ship could change that. The men were still aboard, still working, still hoping the damage might be controlled. Around them, the ice pressed and shifted. Beneath them, the ship that had been their home was beginning to lose the fight. The long months trapped in the Weddell Sea had trained them in patience, routine, and endurance, but now patience would not be enough. The expedition was moving toward a harsher stage, one in which the men would have to step away from the shelter of wood and iron and begin living directly on the ice itself. By the time the pressure began to win, the Endurance had already done more than anyone had the right to expect from her. She had carried the men south through stormy water, heavy pack, fog, cold, and weeks of uncertainty. She had been their transport, their shelter, their workshop, their kitchen, their storehouse, and the closest thing to home in a part of the world where home was not a natural concept. For months, she had sat trapped in the Weddell Sea, locked in ice that rose and shifted around her like a frozen landscape with very poor intentions. She had creaked, groaned, lifted, twisted, and settled again. She had endured, which was rather appropriate, though perhaps by this stage everyone aboard would have preferred a ship with a less demanding name. The men knew the ice was dangerous. They had been living with its sounds for months. They had heard the grinding around the hull, the sudden cracks, the low-pressure noises that seemed to move through the floes like something alive, although of course it was not alive. It was simply ice under force, which in practical terms is not much more comforting. They had watched ridges form nearby, slabs pushed upward by pressure, until the flat white surface became broken and jagged. They had seen cracks open and close. They had understood, in the way sailors understand such things, that the ship was strong but not invulnerable. A wooden vessel in pack ice is caught in a slow contest. If the pressure comes evenly and the hull can rise, the ship may be lifted and squeezed but survive. If the pressure catches her badly, if floes grip her sides and twist her frame, the force can become too much. The ice does not need to be angry. It does not need to hurry. It only needs to keep pressing. That is what makes it so hard to fight. Human beings are built for action. We like to pull, push, repair, shout instructions, fetch tools, and look meaningfully at one another while pretending this is all under control. But pressure ice gives very little respect to activity. It moves because wind and current move it, and a person with a saw or pole is a very small thing beside thousands of tons of shifting frozen sea. In October 1915, after the long Antarctic winter, the worst pressures came. The ice around the Endurance began to move with greater violence. Floes pressed against the hull. The ship was forced over. Timbers strained. The deck buckled. Water entered. The men worked at the pumps and tried to save her. They did not abandon hope immediately, that is important. Ships are not given up lightly, especially when a ship is the only solid shelter for hundreds of miles. There was labour, urgency and stubborn effort. Men moved in the cold, handled gear, checked damage, and fought to keep the Endurance alive. But the ship was being crushed, not damaged in a way that could be tidied up with a plank, a nail and a reassuring cup of tea. Crushed. The pressure forced her sides inward and twisted her structure. Beams cracked. The engine room flooded. The sound of breaking wood must have been awful to hear, because it was not merely the sound of property being destroyed, it was the sound of safety failing. A ship has a voice, and the Endurance was speaking in the language of splintering timber. Shackleton knew what the decision meant before he gave it. On October the 27th, 1915, he ordered the men to abandon ship. The words were simple, but the meaning was enormous. They were leaving the Endurance not because they wished to, not because the expedition had ended neatly, not because rescue was waiting, but because staying aboard had become too dangerous. The ship could no longer be trusted to hold them. The one thing that had separated them from the ice had to be given up. For the men, stepping off the ship and onto the floe was not just a physical movement. It was the end of the expedition as originally imagined. Until that moment, some part of the old plan still had a place to hide. The crossing was unlikely, yes. The landing had failed, yes. The ship had drifted far from where she was meant to be, certainly. But as long as the Endurance remained under them, there was still a vessel, still a base, still a structure that belonged to the world of ships and voyages. Once they left her, they became men camped on moving ice in the middle of the Weddell Sea. That is a different category of problem altogether. They carried what they could. Tents, food, sleeping bags, tools, instruments, clothing, medical supplies, and the ship's lifeboats had to be moved onto the ice. The 3 boats would become essential later: the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. At that moment they were heavy, awkward, and necessary. A lifeboat on a ship is hope stored neatly for emergency use. A lifeboat dragged across pressure ice is hope with a lot of splinters, shouting, and exhausted men attached to it. The salvage work was urgent and difficult. The men had to decide what mattered most. In ordinary life, packing can be strangely emotional, even when the greatest risk is forgetting a toothbrush. Here, every item had weight, and weight was life. Too much carried, and the men would not be able to move. Too little carried, and they might not survive. Shackleton had to be severe. Personal possessions were limited. Supplies had to be chosen for practical use. Food, shelter, fuel, navigation, medicine, tools, and the boats mattered most. Sentiment had to become very small. One of the most striking salvage decisions involved Frank Hurley's photographic plates. Hurley had documented the voyage with extraordinary care, using glass plates that were heavy, fragile, and completely unsuited to easy survival travel. Yet those images were the expedition's record. They were proof of what had happened. They were also part of Hurley's life's work. When the ship was being abandoned, he could not carry everything. Accounts describe him selecting the most important negatives and destroying many others so that he would not be tempted to save what could not be transported. That is a hard detail to sit with. Imagine making a history of a place, then smashing part of that history with your own hands, because survival has stricter rules than memory. It was practical, but it could not have been easy. Shackleton also ordered that unnecessary items be left behind. This was not cruelty. It was arithmetic. Every pound taken from the ship had to be hauled across ice by men already facing cold, fatigue, and uncertainty. A keepsake might comfort someone for an hour, but food could keep him alive. A book might be loved, but fuel might mean warmth. There is a kind of leadership that requires knowing when kindness must be expressed through firmness. Shackleton allowed some personal items, but the general rule was clear. They were no longer travellers with luggage, they were survivors with loads. The men made camp on the ice near the damaged ship. This camp would be called Ocean Camp, a name that sounds almost cheerful until one remembers that the ocean was underneath the floor. Their tent stood on a floe that drifted with the pack, and their world had become alarmingly temporary. Sea ice is not land. It can crack, it can break apart, it can open into leads of black water. It can shift at night while people sleep, which is a deeply inconsiderate habit for anything pretending to be a campsite. The men now had to live with the knowledge that their ground was floating, moving and changing. The first nights after abandoning the Endurance must have felt strange. The ship was still nearby, damaged but visible, a wounded shape in the ice. The men had slept for months inside her walls, and now they were in tents, with the cold closer, the wind more personal, and the sounds of ice no longer filtered by wooden cabins. The difference between being cold inside a ship and being cold on the ice is not small. A tent can protect, but it cannot reassure in quite the same way. Canvas is useful, but it does not have the same emotional authority as a hull. Still, order continued. Shackleton divided duties, food was issued, watches were kept. The men prepared for a possible march toward land. At first, Shackleton hoped they might haul the boats and stores across the ice toward Paulet Island, or another possible point of safety. There were known depots in the region from earlier expeditions, at least in theory, and reaching land seemed like the sensible goal. The problem, as usual, was the ice. It was broken, ridged, uneven, and moving. Dragging heavy boats over such a surface was brutally difficult. Men sank into soft snow, climbed pressure ridges, struggled over broken floes, and made very little distance for enormous effort. This is another part of the story that deserves careful attention. When people imagine survival journeys, they often picture clear hardship but also clear progress. Men pull sledges. The landscape is hard. The goal is ahead. Slowly they advance. In the Weddell Sea, it was not so simple. The men could spend hours hauling and gain only a small distance, while the drifting ice carried them in another direction. They might work like heroes and discover that the pack had undone much of their progress. It is difficult to remain enthusiastic when the floor itself is quietly voting against you. The boats were particularly troublesome. They were essential for eventual escape, but almost impossible to move over rough ice without exhausting the men. Each boat had to be dragged by teams with ropes, rollers, and whatever methods could be contrived. The surface was not a smooth, frozen road. It was pressure ridges, soft snow, cracks, slush, and uneven flows. The men had to unload, reload, pull, lift, shove, rest, and repeat. It was slow work, and slow work in extreme cold has a way of consuming both strength and patience. After attempts to march, Shackleton had to reconsider. He saw that hauling everything across the ice was not practical under those conditions. A leader in such circumstances must be willing to change plans quickly, but not so quickly that he appears uncertain. That is a difficult balance. Changing course can look like failure if badly handled. Refusing to change can become actual failure with frostbite attached. Shackleton chose to camp and drift with the ice for a time, saving the men's strength until conditions improved or the pack carried them closer to open water. It was not satisfying, but it was sensible. Meanwhile, the Endurance continued to suffer. The men visited her when possible to salvage more supplies. She was no longer safe as a home, but she still contained useful things. Food, timber, gear, and equipment were removed. The ship that had once carried them now became a source of materials, almost like a wreck before she had fully died. That must have felt uncomfortable. To walk through familiar spaces and strip them for survival is to admit that the old life is over. The dining area, the cabins, the deck, the storage spaces, all the small places that had held routine were now being emptied, because the men needed every practical advantage. There is a photograph of the Endurance in the ice that has become famous. Her masts and rigging standing against the frozen world, the hull caught and tilted, the pressure ridges around her. It is beautiful in the way disaster can sometimes be beautiful from a safe distance. But the men did not experience it as an image, They experienced it as loss. They knew the smells, sounds, and movements of that ship. They knew where things were stored, where men slept, where meals were served, where conversations had taken place. Watching her fail was not like watching an object break. It was like watching a home become unusable in slow motion. The dogs, too, remained part of camp life, though their future had become grim. With the crossing impossible and food limited, the animals could not all be kept indefinitely. At different points, some of the dogs were killed, a decision that was practical and painful. It is one of those details that survival stories cannot honestly smooth over. The men had cared for them. They had worked with them. They had known them by name, but food, strength, and priorities had changed. Antarctica forced decisions that would be unthinkable in a comfortable room. That is one reason these stories should be told gently, but not falsely. Survival often has sorrow in it, and not all of it belongs to humans. At Ocean Camp, the men had to adjust to a new diet and a new economy of supplies. Seal and penguin meat became increasingly important. Blubber could be used for fuel. Hunting parties went out when animals were available. Stored rations had to be managed carefully. Meals became simpler, and hunger became more familiar. Yet the cook still did what he could. Hot food remained essential for morale. Even when ingredients were limited, the act of preparing and serving a meal helped preserve ordinary life. There is comfort in being handed something warm, even when that something has been produced from ingredients no sensible restaurant would put on a menu without an apology. The cold pressed in more directly now. The men slept in tents on the ice, in sleeping bags that became damp and stiff. Clothing was hard to dry. The surface beneath them could change. Wind could make simple tasks miserable. Getting up in the morning required effort before the day had even properly started. If you have ever struggled to leave a warm bed on a winter morning, imagine doing so while lying on frozen sea ice, and knowing that your commute involves survival. It does put the ordinary alarm clock into perspective, though it may not make it any more charming. Shackleton kept discipline, but he also knew when to allow flexibility. The men needed work, but not pointless work. They needed rest, but not idleness. They needed honesty, but not despair. He maintained the sense that they were still moving toward survival, even when physically they were waiting. This was one of his most important achievements. He transformed helpless drift into a plan, or at least into a waiting strategy with purpose. The ice would carry them, they would conserve strength, they would be ready when open water came. It was not heroic in the dramatic sense, but it was psychologically vital. Frank Wilde helped hold the group steady. His experience and calm made him invaluable. Men like Wilde, Worsley, Crean, and others formed a core of competence around Shackleton. Leadership in such conditions is not only one person at the top, it is a network of trust. The men had to believe that the officers knew what they were doing. They had to believe that orders had reason behind them. They had to believe that effort was not being wasted. Shackleton's authority mattered, but so did the quiet competence of those beneath him. The Endurance finally sank on November 21st, 1915. By then, she'd been abandoned for weeks and crushed beyond saving. The men watched as the sea took her. The ice had opened enough for her damaged remains to go down, and the ship disappeared beneath the water. The masts, rigging, and hull that had been visible for so long were gone. The Endurance would not come home. There must have been a finality in that moment that no order could soften. Until she sank, the ship still existed. Broken? Yes. Abandoned? Yes. But present. A man could look at her and remember that he had once lived aboard her. He could still imagine, however irrationally, some connection to the original voyage. When she disappeared, that connection went with her. They were now truly shipless. Their home was tents. Their transport was 3 small boats lying on the ice. Their road was whatever the pack ice and the sea might eventually allow. Shackleton recorded the loss with restrained words, but the meaning was clear. The ship was gone. From that point, the expedition had one purpose only: to reach safety. No crossing, no glory in the intended sense, no landing base, no grand march over the pole, just 28 men drifting on ice with limited supplies and a long chain of difficulties ahead. Yet even at this low point, there was a kind of clarity. The mission had narrowed completely. Shackleton no longer had to balance scientific aims, exploration goals, and public achievement. He had one task: bring them home. It is easy, from a distance, to treat the sinking of the Endurance as the central disaster, the great dramatic loss. And it was. But in another sense, it was also the end of a long argument between hope and reality. Reality had been making its case for months. The ice had stopped the ship, carried her away from the landing site, crushed her, forced the men onto the floe, and finally swallowed her. There was no longer any room for the original dream. Sometimes that kind of certainty can be strangely useful. Hard truth is painful, but at least it stops the mind from bargaining with false possibilities. The men at Ocean Camp now had to live without the ship's presence. The camp itself became their world. They organised tents, stores, boats, cooking areas, and routines. They watched the drift. They hunted when possible. They conserved energy. They argued with discomfort, hunger, and cold in the daily way that people do when there's no alternative. The ice continued moving, sometimes carrying them nearer to possible escape, sometimes not. The sea beneath them remained hidden until cracks opened, dark and cold, reminding everyone that their camp was floating on something that would kill them quickly if it chose. In those weeks, the men had to accept a slower rhythm. They were not yet in the boats, they were not yet on land, they were between worlds, no longer sailors in the ordinary sense and not yet castaways on an island. They were castaways on moving ice, which is a very specific and inconvenient category. A desert island at least has the courtesy to stay where it is. Their floe had no such manners. Still, they lived. That is the plain fact at the centre of all this. The ship was gone, but the men were alive. They had salvaged food, boats, equipment, and enough order to continue. Their situation was severe, but not hopeless. Shackleton understood that survival would depend on waiting for the right chance, not rushing into the wrong one. Open water would come eventually. The pack would break. The boats would be needed. Until then, the men had to endure the camp, the drift, the cold, and the uneasy knowledge that everything they owned now rested on ice. The loss of the Endurance changed the story forever, but it did not break the group. That is perhaps the most important thing. The ship broke, the plan broke, the crossing broke, but the human structure, the discipline, trust, and stubborn will to continue held together. Shackleton's men were now entering a phase that would test them in a different way. The problem was no longer how to save a ship. It was how to live on a frozen surface that might crack beneath them, how to keep bodies fed and minds steady, and how to prepare for a journey by boat that none of them could yet take. The Endurance had gone down into the dark water under the ice, and above her, on the drifting floe, 28 men remained, watching, waiting, and beginning the long, uncomfortable business of surviving without her. With the Endurance gone beneath the ice, the men were left with a kind of silence that must have felt different from all the silences before it. The Antarctic had always been quiet in its own way, apart from wind, cracking ice, barking dogs, and the endless small sounds of shipboard life. But now the ship's sounds were missing. No familiar creak of timber around them. No footsteps on deck above a cabin. No engine room, no galley in the old sense. No safe wooden walls holding back the weather. The Endurance had been crushed and swallowed, and in her place there were tents, sledges, salvaged stores, 3 small boats, and the wide, shifting surface of the Weddell Sea. The men were not on land. That point matters. A camp usually suggests a fixed place. You pitch tents, mark the area, build routines, and at least the ground has the decency to remain under you. Shackleton's men had no such certainty. Their camp sat on sea ice, and the sea ice drifted with wind and current. It could crack, split, grind, rise, sink, and carry them in directions they had not chosen. The men were living on a moving floor floating above black Antarctic water, and every ordinary task had to be done with that fact in the background. Even sleep had to share space with it. Their first main camp after leaving the ship was Ocean Camp. The name was accurate, if not especially comforting. The ocean was indeed involved, mostly underneath them, which is not where one usually wants the ocean when trying to rest. The camp had tents for sleeping, areas for stores, places for cooking, and the lifeboats resting nearby like awkward promises. The James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancombe Wills were not yet their transport, but everyone knew they might become the difference between life and death. At that stage they were heavy, difficult to move, and absolutely necessary. A useful combination, but not a pleasant one. Shackleton's first hope had been to march over the ice toward land, dragging boats and supplies with them. It made sense in theory. If they could reach land or a known depot, they would be safer than drifting helplessly with the pack. But theory met the actual surface of the ice, and had a rather poor morning. The floes were broken and uneven. Pressure ridges blocked the way. Soft snow slowed every step. The boats were brutally heavy. Men hauled, strained, slipped, lifted, and struggled, only to make painfully little progress. Worse still, the drifting pack could carry them backward or sideways while they worked. It is discouraging enough to walk uphill in a headwind. It is worse when the hill is floating and appears to have its own travel plans. After exhausting attempts, Shackleton made the practical decision to stop trying to force a march across impossible ice. They would camp and drift. This was not surrender, it was calculation. The men needed to save their strength for the moment when open water appeared and the boats could be used. Pulling the boats over bad ice might break the men before it brought them any closer to safety. Waiting could feel passive, but it was the wiser choice. In the Antarctic, action is not always courage. Sometimes courage is stopping before effort becomes waste. Life on the drifting ice became a matter of routine, discipline, and careful use of supplies. Every day had to be shaped, because without structure the men could have slipped into worry and idleness. Shackleton understood that morale needed a timetable. The men woke, ate, worked, hunted when possible, checked the ice, cared for equipment, repaired clothing, and kept watch. Meals divided the day. Duties gave men reasons to move. Conversations, jokes, and small habits kept the camp human. It was not enough to be alive in the physical sense. They had to remain a functioning group. The tents were cramped, cold, damp, and deeply personal. Men slept close together, with little privacy and no real escape from one another. In normal life, if someone annoys you, you may leave the room, take a walk, close a door, or at least stare meaningfully out of a window. On a drifting floe in the Weddell Sea, the options were fewer. A man's habits became common property. Snoring, complaining, cheerfulness, silence, jokes repeated too often, the way someone handled food, the way someone shook snow from his clothing, all of it could become important. Human beings are social animals, but we are also animals who benefit from the occasional wall. The sleeping bags became a serious problem. Many of them were made of reindeer skin, warm in dry cold, but difficult once damp. Moisture froze, bags stiffened, clothing became clammy. Drying things was hard because fuel was limited, and the environment was determined to remain frozen. A damp sleeping bag in Antarctica is not a minor inconvenience. It steals warmth, sleep, and patience. The men had to climb into cold, stiff bedding after days of work, hunger, and worry, and then wake to repeat the same life on the same drifting surface. This is the kind of hardship that does not sound dramatic in one sentence, but becomes enormous when lived night after night. Food was one of the great daily concerns. They had salvaged stores from the Endurance, but those stores had to last for an unknown time. No one knew when the ice would break, when they could launch the boats, or whether they could reach land once they did. Rations had to be controlled carefully. The men ate sledging biscuits, preserved food, seal meat, penguin meat, and whatever could be prepared under camp conditions. A hot drink or warm meal could change the mood of a tent. It could not make the situation safe, but it could make men feel human for a while. This is one reason cooks matter so much in survival stories. A cook does not merely make food, a cook gives the day a centre. Seal and penguin hunting became essential. Fresh meat helped prevent scurvy and stretch the stores. Seal blubber could be burned as fuel, smoky and unpleasant perhaps, but useful. Hunting was not always easy or predictable. Animals were not available simply because men were hungry. The hunters had to go out in cold and poor conditions, watch for cracks, and bring back heavy meat over rough ice. A seal might mean many meals. A lack of seals might mean tighter rations and quieter faces around the cooking area. Hunger changes conversation. It makes people count. It makes every portion visible. It makes fairness important. The dogs were still present for much of this period, and their place in camp life was complicated. They were lively, useful, familiar, and loved by many of the men. They were also mouths to feed in a place where food was limited, and the original sledging journey was no longer possible. Shackleton and his officers had to make hard decisions. Some of the dogs were shot when it became clear that they could not be kept. This was a painful part of the expedition, but it was tied to survival. The men had brought the dogs for work across the continent. Now there would be no crossing, and the priority had become keeping 28 men alive. It is easy to feel the sadness of it, and right to feel it. It is also necessary to see the reality. In that place, kindness could not always mean preservation. Sometimes it meant preventing worse suffering and saving food for the men. After the Endurance sank, Frank Hurley continued to preserve the visual record as best he could. He had already chosen a limited number of glass negatives to save and had destroyed many others. The images that remained were precious, but every item carried had to justify its weight. Hurley's work gives us faces, tents, boats, dogs, pressure ice, and the hard shape of their world. Yet for the men, those scenes were not historic photographs. They were Tuesday or Thursday, or whatever the date happened to be, assuming anyone felt the date was still behaving usefully. The camera held moments still, while the flow under the men kept moving. Dates mattered, but not in the ordinary way. The men kept records, and Worsley continued to track their drift. The camp was carried slowly northward and westward through the Weddell Sea. Some days this drift offered hope. If the ice carried them closer to open water, then waiting had purpose. Other days the drift was frustrating or uncertain. They were passengers on a frozen system, and the system did not explain itself. Imagine waking each morning and discovering that your entire street had moved during the night. Not enough to be useful, perhaps, but enough to remind you that you were not in charge. The ice itself became a constant subject of study. Men watched cracks, ridges, pressure, and the general condition of the flow. They needed a stable enough surface for camp, but they also needed the pack to break eventually so the boats could be launched. Too solid, and they remained trapped. Too broken, and camp became dangerous. Antarctica was offering them one of its favourite choices. Bad in one direction, bad in the other. Please choose carefully. When cracks opened near the tents or stores, the men had to move quickly. Equipment could not be allowed to fall into the sea. Food could not be lost. Boats could not be damaged. A crack in the ice was not a scenic feature. It was an instruction. As the weeks passed, Shackleton moved the camp when necessary. Ocean Camp eventually gave way to Patience Camp, a name that sounds almost humorous because patience was not optional. It was not a virtue they had chosen for self-improvement. It was the condition of remaining alive. Patience Camp was established on another floe, and there the waiting continued. The men had to endure monotony, cold, hunger, uncertainty, and the slow mental weight of not knowing when the next stage would come. They were no longer trying to save the ship. They were waiting for the ice to release them into a new danger. Shackleton's leadership during this period was careful and personal. He watched the men closely. He knew who was weakening. He knew who was becoming discouraged. He understood that some men needed responsibility, while others needed encouragement, quiet monitoring, or direct control. He kept potential troublemakers close to him when necessary. This was not only about authority, it was about preventing anxiety and resentment from spreading. In a small group under pressure, one sour mood can become a kind of weather. Shackleton could not change the Antarctic weather, but he could try to manage the humankind. He also took care to preserve fairness. Rations, workloads, and risks had to be handled in ways the men could accept. Nothing damages trust faster than the feeling that hardship is being shared unevenly. In a comfortable office, unfairness may lead to resentment and a strongly worded conversation near the kettle. On drifting ice, it could become dangerous. Shackleton's men did not have to love every decision, but they had to believe decisions were being made for the good of the whole group. That belief held. Frank Wild remained one of Shackleton's greatest strengths. His calm, experience, and firmness helped steady the camp. Wild had the kind of reliability that does not always attract as much attention as dramatic heroics, but is often more useful. He could manage men, organise work, and carry authority without noise. In hard conditions, a steady second in command is a treasure. A leader cannot be everywhere at once, especially when everywhere is cold, slippery, and full of problems. Worsley's navigation continued to be vital, even though they were not sailing. He observed their position, followed the drift, and helped Shackleton understand where the pack was carrying them. Later, his navigation would become almost miraculous in importance, but even here, while camped on ice, his skill mattered. To survive, they needed not only food and shelter, but knowledge of where they were. A group without position is not only lost geographically, it is lost mentally. Knowing the drift gave shape to their situation. The men's diaries and memories show that life on the ice was not one continuous state of misery. There were bad days, certainly. There were cold days, hungry days, frightened days, and days when the ice made sleep difficult. But there were also games, songs, jokes, reading, and conversation. The men found ways to pass time because time had become one of their heavier supplies. They had a great deal of it and no easy way to spend it well. Someone might read aloud, someone might mend clothing. Someone might joke about food with the seriousness of a man who has thought about dinner far too often. They celebrated small occasions when they could. Small ceremonies, even silly ones, can hold a group together. There is no need to imagine them as constantly solemn. In fact, they could not afford to be. Humour was part of survival. Not loud comedy, not denial, but the small, dry humour of men who knew their circumstances were dreadful and decided to make remarks anyway. A joke about cold food or a miserable bedroll did not solve anything, but it kept the mind from becoming too fixed on fear. Human beings need some space between themselves and disaster, even if that space is only a joke told through chattering teeth. The weather remained a steady enemy. Snow, wind, and low temperatures made everything harder. Cooking took effort. Moving stores took effort. Dressing took effort. Even going outside the tent could feel like a negotiation. Wind could drive snow into clothing, eyes, and equipment. Visibility could fall. The cold could make hands clumsy and tempers shorter. In such conditions, a simple task like shifting supplies or checking a boat could become a small expedition of its own. Antarctica has a talent for making ordinary jobs feel personally insulting. The boats had to be protected. They were the men's future, though not yet useful in the present. They were strengthened, checked, and kept ready as much as possible. The James Caird in particular would later become famous, but at Patience Camp it was still one of 3 boats that had to be kept from damage. The men knew that once open water came, These boats would carry them through seas that could overturn or freeze them. A boat that seemed large on deck could look very small beside the Southern Ocean. This is one of the less comforting truths about boats. Their size depends greatly on what you're asking them to face. As the drift continued, the men hoped to reach the vicinity of islands or at least open water from which they could sail toward land. Possible destinations included Elephant Island, Clarence Island, and others in that remote region. But none were easy. None were close in a comforting way, and reaching any of them required the pack to break enough for launching, while not breaking so badly that the camp was destroyed before they were ready. The men were waiting for a narrow opportunity, one that had to arrive in the right form at the right time. Too early, too late, too rough, too little water, too much water, and the problem changed again. The ice floe beneath them slowly shrank and weakened. Cracks appeared more often. Leads opened nearby. The camp had to be moved and reorganised. The men became more aware that the waiting period was ending, though not in a way that promised comfort. Open water meant escape from the flow, but it also meant exposure to the sea. The boats would be crowded, the water would be freezing, spray could turn to ice on clothing and gear, waves could separate the boats, navigation would be difficult, landing on any shore would be dangerous. The end of waiting was not rescue. It was the beginning of another test. Food supplies were now strained. The men were hungry more often, and rationing had become tighter. Hunger wears people down quietly. It makes bodies weaker and moods sharper. It makes sleep harder. It turns thoughts toward meals remembered from home, which is a cruel but common habit of the mind. A man lying in a frozen tent may remember bread, stew, tea, fruit, or some ordinary meal he barely noticed when he had it. Memory can be generous and unkind at the same time. Shackleton continued to present confidence, but he was under immense pressure. He had to choose the right moment to launch. If he waited too long, the floe might break under them or drift into worse conditions. If he launched too soon, the boats might be caught among grinding floes and crushed. The men had survived the loss of the ship and months on drifting ice. A bad decision now could undo everything. Leadership often looks simple afterward, because history knows what happened. At the time, it was judgment made in cold, hunger, uncertainty, and incomplete information. The men packed and repacked. Loads had to be reduced again. What had seemed essential at one stage became too heavy at the next. Survival keeps narrowing the list. At first, a man wants possessions, then tools, then food, then warmth, then simply a place not to drown. The expedition's material world had been shrinking since the ship was abandoned, and now it would shrink further into what could fit inside 3 open boats. By early April 1916, the ice was breaking around them. The floe they had depended on was no longer safe as a long-term camp. Water opened. Pressure continued. The boats had to be prepared for launching. The men were tired, hungry, and weakened by months of exposure, but they had also been shaped by those months. They had learned to live together under pressure. They had learned to obey routines. They had learned that plans could change without the group falling apart. They had learned to endure waiting, which is not a small skill. The final days on the drifting ice must have carried a strange mixture of relief and dread. Relief, because the ice was finally opening and the chance to move had come. Dread, because the open boats were no easy road. The men had been trapped on ice, but at least the ice had given them a surface. Now they would enter freezing water in small craft, crowded with gear and exhausted bodies. The sea that had been hidden beneath them would become the thing they had to cross. The boats were hauled to the edge. Stores were loaded. Men took their places. The camp that had been their whole world was about to be left behind. There would be no return to the Endurance, no stable base, no ship, no easy landing ahead. Only the boats, the broken pack, the wind, the cold sea, and the hope that somewhere beyond the white confusion of ice and water There was land solid enough to stand on. The moment the men climbed into the boats, their world became smaller, wetter, and much less forgiving. For months, the ice had been their prison, their flaw, and sometimes their enemy. But it had at least given them a place to stand. Now that place was breaking apart beneath them, and the only way forward was into the water they had been trying not to fall into since the Endurance was first trapped. The sea was no longer hidden under the floe. It was beside them, under them, around them, and very soon, splashing over them with all the enthusiasm of a thing that had waited patiently for its turn. The 3 lifeboats were loaded with men, food, gear, and as much hope as could be fitted without sinking them. The James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills had been dragged, repaired, strengthened, and guarded through the long weeks on the ice. Now they had to do what they had been saved for. They were not large boats. They were not comfortable boats. They were not designed to carry exhausted men across broken Antarctic seas in freezing weather while surrounded by drifting ice. But they were what the men had, and in survival, what you have quickly becomes what must be enough. Launching them was not simple. Nothing in the Weddell Sea had been simple for a very long time, and the ice saw no reason to change its habits now. The floes shifted. Leads of water opened and closed. Edges broke. The boats had to be pushed and hauled into the water while the men tried to keep supplies from falling in, hulls from being crushed, and themselves from being soaked before the journey had properly begun. A wet man in Antarctic conditions was a serious problem. A soaked sleeping bag, a lost food bag, a damaged boat, or one careless slip could change everything. The margin for error had become thin enough to make even small mistakes feel large. Once afloat, the men had to row and sail through a maze of ice and water. They were not heading across a calm harbour toward a friendly dock, with someone waving and asking if they wanted soup. They were moving through pack ice that could close around them, smash the boats, or separate them. The water was freezing. The air cut through clothing. The men were crowded together, unable to stretch properly, unable to dry themselves, and unable to rest in any meaningful way. A lifeboat at sea is not a room. It is a container for discomfort with oars attached. Shackleton divided the men among the boats and kept the little fleet together as best he could. The James Caird, commanded by Shackleton himself, was the largest and strongest. The Dudley Docker was under Worsley's command, and the Stancomb Wills under Hubert Hudson, though the physical and mental strain of the voyage placed heavy demands on everyone. Frank Wild, Tom Crean, and the other experienced men helped hold order in circumstances that had very little interest in order. Their immediate goal was to reach land, any land that could offer a stable place to camp. Elephant Island, Clarence Island, and other points in the South Shetlands were possible destinations, but possibility on a map is a much friendlier thing than possibility in a storm. The men had been weakened by months on the ice. They were hungry, cold, and tired before the boat journey even began. That is easy to overlook. It was not as though a fresh crew stepped into the boats after a good breakfast and a sensible night's sleep. These men had lived for months in tents on drifting ice, with limited rations, damp clothing, hard labour, and constant uncertainty. Their bodies were already worn down. Their nerves had already been stretched. Now they had to row, bail, navigate, and survive in open boats in one of the worst marine environments on Earth. It was rather like being told, after completing a marathon in bad shoes, that the next activity would be wrestling the weather while sitting in a bucket. The boats moved through leads when they could, and were sometimes blocked by ice. When the wind helped, sails were used. When it did not, the men rowed. Rowing in such conditions was exhausting. Hands blistered and stiffened. Clothing froze. Spray came over the sides. The boats rose and dropped in waves. Ice floes moved nearby, sometimes too close for comfort, though comfort had not been seen for some time and may have wisely chosen to remain elsewhere. The men had to watch constantly. A floe could crush a boat if it caught her badly. A wave could swamp her. A wrong move could separate the boats beyond easy contact. Keeping the boats together was important but difficult. In rough seas, each boat moved differently. Visibility changed. Snow, spray, and darkness reduced what the men could see. One boat might be lifted on a swell, while another disappeared behind water or ice. Voices could be lost in the wind. The fear of separation was real because each boat alone would have been far more vulnerable. Together they could share judgment, encouragement, and at least the knowledge that no one had vanished yet. That knowledge matters when the world has narrowed to cold water, tired faces, and the next wave. Navigation was a constant challenge. Frank Worsley's skill became essential. In good conditions, a navigator can take sights, calculate position, and maintain a course with some confidence. These were not good conditions. The sky was often hidden. The boats were moving violently. The men were wet, cold, and cramped. Instruments had to be protected and used when possible. A brief break in cloud could become precious. Worsley had to judge position with limited observations, experience, instinct, and the kind of calm that is easier to admire than to possess. A mistake could mean missing land entirely, and missing land in those waters did not offer many cheerful alternatives. The men suffered badly from thirst. This may sound surprising in a story full of ice and water, but seawater cannot be drunk, and melting ice or snow required fuel and equipment they could not easily use in the open boats. Fresh water was limited. Their mouths became dry, lips cracked, throats burned. Hunger is painful, but thirst becomes urgent in a different way. It fills the mind. It makes a person think of streams, cups, kettles, rain barrels, and every ordinary glass of water ever taken for granted. A cup of plain water, in such a moment, would have seemed luxurious enough to deserve its own small national holiday. Sleep was almost impossible. The men were packed into the boats, wet and freezing. There was no comfortable position. Some tried to doze sitting up or leaning against one another. Others had to keep rowing, bailing, steering, or watching. Even when a man closed his eyes, the movement of the boat, the cold, the noise, and the danger kept real rest out of reach. Lack of sleep changes people. It slows thought, shortens tempers, and makes simple tasks harder. In those boats, exhaustion was not a feeling they could solve. It became part of the weather inside them. The cold worked on them without pause. Spray froze on clothing and gear. Hands became numb, feet suffered. Some men developed frostbite. Salt water soaked into fabric, then chilled and stiffened. The boats did not offer shelter in any generous sense. Their coverings and makeshift arrangements helped a little, but no one was dry, warm, and comfortable. The men huddled, bailed, rowed, and endured. A person in such conditions does not think in large heroic sentences. He thinks about his hands, his feet, the next mouthful, the next order, the next minute. Survival often reduces the mind to immediate facts, which may be one reason people survive. The future is too large. The next task is small enough to hold. Food was difficult to manage. They carried rations, but eating in an open boat in freezing weather is not like sitting down to a meal. The men needed calories, but cooking was limited, and everything was wet, cramped, and moving. A biscuit could become precious. A small portion of meat or ration could matter intensely. Eating also required effort when men were cold and seasick. Seasickness added misery to an already crowded list. It drains strength, makes food harder to keep down, and leaves a person weak at the exact time when weakness is least useful. The Southern Ocean did not provide a gentle introduction. There were moments when the boats had to be pulled onto ice floes so the men could rest or wait for better conditions. This was not always restful. A floe might be unstable, small, or threatened by pressure. Landing a boat on ice and later relaunching it took effort. The men had to unload or shift weight, drag boats, watch for cracks, and remain alert. But even a brief pause from the movement of the sea could help. Men could stretch stiff limbs, attempt to prepare something warm, or lie down for a little while, though the cold ground beneath them was hardly a feather bed. Still, After hours in an open boat, even frozen ice could feel like a kind of improvement, which shows how generous the mind can become when expectations are lowered far enough. The weather changed often and rarely in a helpful direction. Wind could push them off course. Snow could reduce visibility. Waves could rise. Ice could block progress. The men had to choose between dangers. Stay near the ice, and they risked being crushed or trapped. Move into open water, and they faced larger waves and exposure. There was no safe route. There were only routes that seemed slightly less likely to kill them immediately, which is not the sort of travel advice one hopes to receive. As they moved northward and westward, the search for land became more intense. Land meant a stable camp, fresh snow or ice for water, possible wildlife for food, and an end to the immediate danger of the boats. But land in Antarctica and the subantarctic islands is not automatically safety. Many coastlines are cliffs, rocks, surf, ice and snow. A boat can reach land and still be unable to land. A wave can smash a boat against rocks. A beach may be narrow, exposed or unsafe. Still, after days in the boats, even a harsh shore could become the most beautiful thing in the world. The men aimed toward Elephant Island. The name has a friendly weight to it, almost comic, as though one might arrive and find a large grey animal politely guarding a harbour. The reality was much less charming. Elephant Island is remote, mountainous, icy, and exposed to violent weather. It had no settlement. No regular ships came looking there. No warm welcome waited. But it was land. It was solid. After months on moving ice and days in open boats, solid land was not a small gift. It was the difference between constantly drifting and being able to stop. The final approach was brutal. The men were exhausted and nearly at the limit of what they could do. They had been at sea for days, soaked, sleepless, thirsty and hungry. The boats had to be handled through surf and around ice and rocks. Landing in such conditions required timing and strength. A mistake could capsize a boat or throw men into freezing water at the very edge of rescue. That would be a particularly cruel sort of failure, to survive the Weddell Sea and then lose everything within sight of land. Antarctica, however, had already shown that it had no objection to cruel timing. On April 15th, 1916, after a week in the boats, the men reached Elephant Island. They landed first at a place called Cape Valentine. For the first time in nearly 500 days since leaving South Georgia, they stood on land that was not moving beneath them. Try to imagine that moment without making it too neat. They were not clean. They were not rested. They were not arriving at a safe harbour with blankets and stew. They were stumbling onto a bleak shore after months of cold and strain. Some were frostbitten, many were weak, all were exhausted. But the ground stayed still. That alone must have felt astonishing. A man who has lived on drifting ice does not take stillness for granted. The simple fact that the rocks did not crack open beneath the tents, did not drift overnight, did not carry them farther from hope, must have brought a strange relief. They could land stores. They could pull the boats above the water. They could make camp without fearing that the whole floor would float away before morning. It was not comfort, but it was a different kind of hardship, and sometimes a different hardship can feel almost like mercy. The men were desperate for water. Snow and ice could be melted more easily now that they were ashore, and the chance to drink properly mattered enormously. Thirst had tormented them in the boats. Food could also be prepared with a little more order. Men could lie down, they could stretch, they could stop rowing. These were simple things, but simple things become grand after enough deprivation. A dry patch of ground, a drink, a hot meal, a little sleep, a place to put your feet without them sliding in bilge water. These can become as valuable as any medal. Yet Cape Valentine was not a good long-term camp. It was exposed, narrow, and vulnerable to weather and sea. Shackleton and his officers quickly understood that they needed a better location. Even after reaching land, decisions remained urgent. The men could not simply collapse and declare the problem solved. Elephant Island had given them a shore, but not rescue. They had to move along the coast to a safer place where they could establish a more secure camp. This required putting men back into boats or moving along difficult shoreline, which must have felt deeply unfair. After finally landing, the last thing anyone wanted was more boat work. But survival is not famous for respecting personal preference. They shifted to a more suitable site, later known as Point Wild, named for Frank Wild. It was still bleak and uncomfortable, but it offered better protection and a practical place to camp. The men turned the remaining boats and materials into shelter. They used stones, canvas, sails, and whatever else they had to create a place where they could survive the coming days or weeks. The camp was cramped and rough, but it was above the water and on land. The men were no longer drifting. They had reached a fixed point in the world. At Point Wild, the full truth of their situation became clear. They had survived the loss of the Endurance, months on the ice and the open boat journey. That was remarkable, but no one knew they were there. Elephant Island was far from shipping routes. The chance of a random vessel appearing was very small. They could not simply wait with confidence. Waiting had worked on the ice because the drift itself was carrying them toward change. Waiting on Elephant Island might lead nowhere at all. The island was not a destination in the ordinary sense. It was a pause in a disaster. The men needed rescue, and rescue would not come unless someone went for it. The nearest realistic source of help was South Georgia, the whaling island they had left so long ago. It lay roughly 800 miles away across one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean in the world. Reaching it would require taking one of the small boats, preparing it for a far longer voyage, choosing a crew, and sailing through storms, cold and open sea with only the most careful navigation. It was a plan so difficult that it almost sounds unreasonable, until one remembers that staying on Elephant Island without help was also unreasonable. Survival had become a choice between two terrible options, and Shackleton would have to choose the one that at least allowed action. For the moment, though, the men had land beneath them. Their bodies could begin to recover slightly from the boat journey. Frostbitten feet and hands could be examined, clothing could be adjusted. Food could be organised, the boats could be inspected, the shelter could be improved. Men could sleep without being thrown from side to side by waves. They had crossed the impossible sea in 3 small boats and arrived alive. Every man was still there. Not well, perhaps, not safe in any lasting sense, but alive, together, and no longer on the drifting ice. Shackleton had brought them this far, but the hardest single journey still lay ahead. The James Caird, already battered and vital, would have to be made ready for a voyage beyond what any lifeboat should have been asked to do. The men on Elephant Island would have to wait under Frank Wild's command, trusting that Shackleton could cross the ocean, find South Georgia, reach help, and come back. And Shackleton, looking out from that harsh shore at the sea they had just survived, had to prepare to enter it again. The boat that would have to save them was not a ship in any proper sense. The James Caird was a lifeboat, about 22 feet long, built for emergency use, not for an 800-mile crossing of some of the roughest ocean on Earth. In calmer waters with a fair wind and a good deal of optimism, she might have seemed sturdy enough. On the shore of Elephant Island, facing the Southern Ocean, she looked very small. Not useless, but small in the way a teacup looks small when someone asks it to empty a pond. And yet, Shackleton knew that this boat was now the only real path between 28 stranded men and rescue. Elephant Island had given them land, but not safety. That distinction mattered. The men were no longer drifting on ice, and that was a great relief. But they were stranded on a bleak remote island where no one was likely to find them by accident. There was no settlement, no harbour, no regular traffic, no friendly lighthouse keeper glancing out of a window and saying, "Oh dear, that looks like 28 exhausted polar explorers." They were alone, far from the routes used by most ships. If they stayed and simply waited, they might wait until hunger, cold, Sickness or despair did the work the ice had failed to finish. So Shackleton made the decision that shaped the rest of the story. He would take the James Caird and a small crew across the sea to South Georgia, the island they had left in December 1914. South Georgia was roughly 800 miles away. It had whaling stations, people, ships, food, tools, and the possibility of rescue. It was the nearest realistic place where help could be found. But reaching it meant crossing open ocean in a small, heavily loaded boat, through storms, freezing spray, huge waves and uncertain skies. If they missed the island, there was nothing beyond but more sea, and the Southern Ocean is not the sort of place where one wants to be lost while sitting in a lifeboat and trying to remain cheerful. The James Caird had to be modified before such a journey could even be attempted. Harry McNish, the carpenter, became essential. Whatever tensions had existed between him and Shackleton earlier, his skill now mattered to every man on the island. McNish strengthened the boat as best he could with the limited materials available. He raised the sides, added decking, used parts of the other boats, canvas, spars and seal blood mixed with flour to help make the seams more watertight. It was not a polished shipyard job with clean benches and a kettle waiting nearby. It was emergency engineering on a freezing beach, done with tired hands, limited tools, and the knowledge that a bad seam could mean death. The boat was ballasted with heavy stones to make her more stable. This was necessary, but it also made her heavier. Stores had to be loaded carefully. Food, water, fuel, sleeping bags, navigation instruments, and other supplies were packed into the cramped space. Every item had to be considered. Too little, and the crew would not survive the passage. Too much, and the boat might become dangerously overloaded. The James Caird had to carry 6 men, supplies for the voyage, and enough strength in her hull to withstand seas that could smash a larger vessel. It was a difficult balance, and the margin was narrow. Shackleton chose 5 men to go with him: Frank Worsley, Tom Crean, Harry McNish, John Vincent, and Timothy McCarthy. Each choice had practical reasons. Worsley was the navigator, and without him the journey would be almost impossible. Crean was strong, loyal, and experienced, a man who had already proved himself many times in Antarctic hardship. McNish was needed because the boat might require repairs, and because he had made the modifications that gave her a chance. Vincent was physically powerful and an experienced seaman. McCarthy was dependable and steady. 6 men in a 22-foot boat. 6 men trying to cross a stretch of ocean where even large ships could suffer badly. The remaining men would stay on Elephant Island under Frank Wild's command. This was another heavy decision. Shackleton was leaving most of his crew behind in a rough camp with limited food, poor shelter, and no certainty that he would return. Wild had to keep them alive, organised, and hopeful. He would have to manage rations, maintain morale, and prepare for rescue each day, even if rescue did not come. Shackleton reportedly told him that if anything happened and he did not return, Wild should try to get the men out the following spring. It was a practical instruction, but one can imagine the weight behind it. No one wanted to speak too plainly about the chance that the James Caird might vanish. The men on shore helped launch the boat on April 24, 1916. The weather gave them an opening, and openings in that region had to be used. There could be no long, comfortable farewell. No speeches polished for history. The sea was waiting and the boat had to go. Those remaining on Elephant Island watched Shackleton and the 5 others leave in the James Caird, a small shape moving away from the shore into cold water. It must have been one of the loneliest sights of the entire expedition. For the men left behind, their best hope was disappearing over the water. For the men in the boat, the last sight of the camp meant leaving 22 lives dependent on their success. Once at sea, the scale of the challenge became immediate. The James Caird was packed tight. There was little room to move, no dry comfort, and no real rest. The men were crowded together among stores, stones, wet clothing, ropes, and gear. The boat rose and fell with the swells, sometimes climbing waves that must have seemed far too large for such a small craft. then dropping into troughs where the horizon vanished. Spray came over the sides. Water had to be baled constantly. The cold settled into everything. Their clothes became wet and stiff, their hands cracked and numbed. Their sleeping bags were damp. The boat smelled of men, salt, wet canvas, fuel and discomfort, which is not a fragrance likely to become fashionable. Worsley's navigation was the thread on which the whole attempt hung. To find South Georgia, he had to take sightings of the sun when the sky allowed. That phrase, when the sky allowed, carries a great deal of trouble inside it. The sky was often cloudy or stormy. The boat was pitching and rolling. A sextant reading had to be taken from a small boat on a violent sea, with numb fingers, poor visibility, and very little time. A clear glimpse of the sun might last only moments. Worsley had to brace himself, take the sight, make calculations, and trust his skill. Missing South Georgia would likely mean death. There was no broad continent waiting behind it. There was one island in a vast ocean, and the James Caird had to find it. The men used a sea anchor at times to control the boat in rough weather. They sailed when they could, using the small sails to make progress. When conditions were too dangerous, they endured. The journey was not a steady crossing from one point to another in the neat manner shown by a line on a map. It was a fight to keep the boat afloat while still moving in the right general direction. Wind, current and weather all tried to interfere. The boat leaked, ice formed, water got into everything. The men bailed until bailing itself became part of their existence, like breathing, only colder and more annoying. Thirst became a serious problem again. The casks of fresh water were not perfect. Salt water contaminated some of the supply, making it unpleasant and in some cases nearly undrinkable. Drinking brackish water when already dehydrated is a miserable experience. Food was limited and hard to prepare. They had a small stove, but using it in the crowded, pitching boat was difficult. Hot food or drink was possible only under certain conditions, and even then it took effort. Cold rations kept them alive, but did not give much comfort. The men were wet, hungry, thirsty, and tired, and the boat gave them no room to suffer privately. Sleep came in brief, broken pieces. Some men tried to rest under the small decking where conditions were cramped and airless. Others remained exposed in the cockpit, managing sails, tiller, bailing, or watch. The boat was divided into zones of discomfort, none of them attractive. If a man was not being soaked by spray, he was wedged into a cold, cramped space. If he was not bailing, he was trying to sleep while the boat slammed and rolled. If he did sleep, he woke cold, stiff, and still in the same situation. It is hard to overstate what lack of sleep does over days at sea. It makes judgment harder, muscles weaker, moods darker, and time strange. There were moments of real danger when the sea seemed ready to take them. At one point, they encountered a huge wave, larger than the others, a breaking sea that towered over them. Shackleton later described it as a wave so enormous that he first thought it was a cloud. That is not a comforting mistake. When a wave looks like weather, the boat beneath you begins to feel even smaller. Somehow the James Caird survived it. She rose, dropped, shipped water, and continued. The men bailed, recovered, and kept going. In a larger ship, such a sea would have been frightening. In a lifeboat, it was nearly unbelievable. The cold was constant. Antarctic and sub-Antarctic seas do not merely chill a person. They enter clothing, hands, feet, and joints. Salt spray can freeze. Wet fabric robs warmth. A man's body spends energy just trying not to shut down. Frostbite remained a risk. Skin cracked. Lips split. Fingers lost feeling. Simple tasks became difficult because hands would not work properly. A knot, a cup, a line, a navigation instrument, each demanded effort. The men had to keep functioning even when their bodies had begun to object in every available language. Shackleton's role in the boat was different from his role on the ice. There, he had managed a whole group. Routines, camp decisions and morale over weeks and months. In the James Caird, leadership was compressed into immediate decisions and personal endurance. He had to keep the men focused, encourage them, judge risks, and share the hardship without letting his own doubts show too clearly. A leader in a small boat cannot stand apart. He is wet with the others, hungry with the others, cold with the others. Authority has nowhere to hide. It must prove itself in the same spray. Worsley's confidence was vital. If the navigator had lost belief, the whole boat might have felt it. Instead, he continued to take sightings when he could and guide them toward South Georgia. His skill in that crossing has often been praised, and rightly so. The target was small, the conditions terrible, and the tools limited. Modern navigation has made us almost casual about location. A phone can tell us where we are while we are looking for a cafe, or trying to remember which side street has the nice bakery. Worsley had the sun, a sextant, a chronometer, calculation and judgment, all in a boat that would not stop moving. There is something humbling about that. Days passed in a blur of cold, water and effort. The men were reduced by exposure. Their faces were drawn. Their clothes were filthy and wet. The cramped conditions caused pain and stiffness. The boat's motion never really stopped. The journey lasted 16 days, though for the men aboard it must have felt much longer. Time at sea and hardship does not move cleanly. It stretches around storms and shrinks around exhaustion. The men lived from task to task, from sighting to sighting, from one attempt to cook to the next, from one wave survived to another. Then came signs that they were nearing land, birds, kelp, changes in the sea. These signs could lift hope, but they could also increase anxiety. Being near land in rough weather is not automatically safe. A rocky coast can destroy a boat. South Georgia's western side was wild and exposed, with cliffs, reefs, surf and very few easy landing places. The whaling stations were on the eastern side of the island. The James Caird, driven by conditions and approach, came in on the wrong side. Even success had arrived with a complication, because apparently this expedition had signed some sort of agreement that every achievement must immediately be followed by another problem. On May 8th, 1916, after more than 2 weeks at sea, they sighted South Georgia. It was a moment of immense relief, but they were not yet safe. The weather prevented immediate landing, and they had to stand off, exhausted and desperate, while the island was visible but unreachable. Imagine surviving 800 miles in an open boat, seeing land, and then still having to wait because the shore might kill you if you approached badly. That is the sort of detail that makes a person understand why polar explorers aged so efficiently. They finally landed at King Haakon Bay on the western side of South Georgia. The landing was difficult, but they made it to shore. The 6 men had crossed the Southern Ocean in the James Caird. It remains one of the most remarkable small boat journeys ever made. But again, the story did not give them a neat ending. They had reached South Georgia, yes, but not the inhabited side. The whaling stations, the people who could help rescue the men on Elephant Island, were still separated from them by the island's interior. South Georgia is mountainous, glaciated and rough. Its interior had not been crossed before. The men had escaped the ocean only to find that mountains stood between them and help. First, however, they had to recover. The 6 men were in terrible condition. They were exhausted, cold, salt-crusted, hungry and physically worn down. The James Caird was pulled up and secured. They made camp, rested, and tried to restore enough strength to think clearly. On land, they could melt water, cook more steadily, and sleep without being thrown by waves. But several of the men were too weak to continue over the mountains. Vincent and Macnish were in particularly poor condition, and McCarthy was also left behind when the final crossing began. Shackleton chose only 3 men for the overland journey: himself, Worsley, and Crean. This was another astonishing decision. They had just crossed 800 miles of ocean in an open boat. Most people after such an experience would feel that lying down for a week was not laziness but basic manners. Yet Shackleton could not stop for long. The men on Elephant Island were waiting. Every day mattered. Weather might delay rescue attempts, food might run low, morale might weaken. Shackleton had promised, directly or indirectly, that he would return. He had carried that promise across the sea, and now he had to carry it over mountains. The equipment for the crossing was limited. They had no proper mountaineering gear for such terrain. They improvised. Screws from the boat were fixed into their boots to give better grip on ice. They carried a carpenter's adze, a rope, food, and very little else. The distance across the island to the whaling station at Stromness was not enormous by normal mapping standards, but the terrain made it severe. Glaciers, crevices, ridges, snow slopes, and unknown routes stood in the way. No one had crossed South Georgia's interior before. Shackleton, Worsley and Crean were tired men entering unknown mountains with improvised equipment, because the alternative was waiting while 22 men remained stranded far away. They set out before dawn on May 19th, 1916. The crossing became another test of judgment and endurance. They climbed snow slopes, crossed glaciers, avoided crevasses, and navigated by limited knowledge of the terrain. The weather could change quickly. A wrong route might trap them or force them back. They had to keep moving, but not recklessly. They were short of rest and still weakened by the sea voyage. Their boots, clothing, and gear were poor for the job. Yet they moved across the island, driven by the need to reach people. At one point, they had to descend quickly by sliding down a snow slope in the dark, not knowing exactly what lay below. This was dangerous, but remaining where they were also carried the risk. They chose action. They roped themselves together and slid, trusting luck, snow, and perhaps the fact that after everything else, the universe might allow them one more narrow escape. They survived. The journey continued. There is a kind of exhaustion that moves beyond tiredness into something more automatic. The body keeps going because stopping has become too complicated. After many hours, they heard a sound that must have seemed almost unreal. The whistle from the Stromness whaling station. A human sound. A working sound. A sound tied to meals, shelter, tools, ships, and rescue. After ice, storms, and the empty sea, that whistle meant they were close to help. It was not music exactly, unless one has been through enough hardship, in which case a factory whistle may become the sweetest instrument ever built. When Shackleton, Worsley and Crean reached Stromness, they were barely recognisable. They had long hair, blackened faces, torn clothing, and the look of men who had come from the edge of the world by the least comfortable route available. The whaling station manager, Thorolf Searle, eventually recognised Shackleton. The story is often told with quiet drama. The filthy, exhausted figures arriving, the question of who they were, and the realisation that Shackleton had come back from a ship long presumed lost. For the men at the station, it must have been astonishing. For Shackleton, it was not the end. It was the first real chance to save the rest. Help was now possible. Food, shelter, and care were available for the men who had crossed. The 3 left at King Haakon Bay could be retrieved. Most importantly, plans could begin for rescuing the 22 men on Elephant Island. But the sea and weather would still have their say. Reaching South Georgia did not automatically place a rescue ship on Elephant Island shore. Shackleton had accomplished the impossible crossing, but he still had to return through Antarctic waters and find his men before the island. The cold, or time, took them. The James Caird voyage had changed the odds. It had carried 6 men from isolation to contact with the human world. It had turned a hopeless wait on Elephant Island into a rescue effort. Yet the men left behind did not know this. They could not see South Georgia. They did not know the boat had survived. They did not know Shackleton had reached help. They only knew that he had gone, that days were passing and that the horizon remained empty. For them, the hardest part was continuing to believe in a rescue they could not confirm. For Shackleton, Now standing among people again, after so much cold and sea, the task was clear and urgent. He had to go back. When Shackleton reached Stromness, he had finally returned to the human world, but not in the way anyone would have expected. He did not arrive as the triumphant leader of a completed Antarctic crossing. He did not arrive with flags, scientific specimens neatly packed, and a proud line drawn across the continent. He arrived dirty, exhausted, almost unrecognisable, with Frank Worsley and Tom Crean beside him, all three of them looking as though they had been dragged through every difficult part of the map and then asked to climb the rest. They had crossed the Southern Ocean in the James Caird, landed on the wrong side of South Georgia, crossed the island's unmapped mountains, and reached the whaling station with one purpose still pressing harder than hunger or fatigue. The men on Elephant Island were still waiting. There was relief, of course. There had to be. The sound of voices, the sight of buildings, the smell of food, smoke, oil and human industry must have felt almost unreal after so long among ice, canvas and salt water. Shackleton, Worsley and Crean were taken in, fed, warmed and helped. The three men left behind at King Haakon Bay, McNish, Vincent and McCarthy, also had to be rescued from the other side of South Georgia, and that was done quickly with assistance from the whalers. The 6 men who had made the James Caird journey were safe, or at least as safe as men can be after months of starvation, exposure, and a boat journey that should probably have been reported to the sea as unreasonable behaviour. But Shackleton could not rest into safety. He could not let comfort soften the urgency. There were 22 men still on Elephant Island, living under rough shelter, with limited food, poor protection, and no certainty that the boss, as many called him, had survived. They had watched the James Caird leave. They had watched the horizon after that. Days had passed, then more days. No message could reach them. No signal could tell them that the boat had found South Georgia. They were alone with the wind, the cold, the penguins, the seals, and their own thoughts, which under such conditions are not always the most helpful company. Shackleton began trying to return almost immediately. This is one of the most important details in the whole story. He did not first travel home to explain himself. He did not wait for perfect arrangements. He did not take a long recovery while others handled the problem. He began looking for a ship that could reach Elephant Island. The men had trusted him, and he had left them with a promise that he would come back if he could. Now that help was within reach, the promise became work. The first rescue attempt used the Southern Sky, a vessel that set out from South Georgia. Shackleton, Worsley and Crean were aboard, trying to get back to Elephant Island as quickly as possible. But the ice, which had already spent so much of this story being extremely difficult, was not finished. Pack ice blocked the way. The ship could not get through. They pushed as far as they could, but the conditions made further progress too dangerous or impossible. To have crossed the ocean, reached help, found a ship, sailed back toward the stranded men, and then be stopped by ice again must have been deeply frustrating. It was like arriving at the locked door of a burning house with the key in your hand, only to find a second locked door behind it, and possibly a penguin looking unhelpfully at the hinges. They had to turn back. That must have been bitter. Shackleton knew that every delay mattered. He could picture the camp at Elephant Island. He knew the men would be hungry and cold. He knew morale would become harder to hold with each empty day. He also knew that a failed rescue ship crushed or trapped in the ice would help no one. Once again, he was forced to accept the difference between urgency and recklessness. It was not enough to want to rescue them. He needed a ship that could actually reach them. Meanwhile, on Elephant Island, Frank Wild was doing the quiet, difficult work of keeping the remaining men alive. Wild had been left in command, and he understood his duty clearly. He had to preserve discipline, hope, and health in a camp that offered very little comfort. The men had built shelter using the 2 remaining boats, canvas, stones, and whatever materials they could manage. Their main hut became known as the Snuggery, which is a charming name for a place that was cramped, damp, smoky, cold. and probably not the sort of accommodation one would choose twice. Still, it was shelter. In those conditions, shelter did not need to be elegant. It needed to keep men alive. The camp at Point Wild was narrow and exposed. The sea could be rough. Weather battered the site. Snow fell. Wind pushed cold through every gap. The men slept close together, and the shelter smelled of blubber smoke, damp clothing, tired bodies, and the general atmosphere of people who had long ago stopped expecting laundry day to solve anything. Meals were limited. Penguins and seals were hunted when available, and their meat kept the men alive. Blubber provided fuel, though it burned smokily and coated everything with soot. A person may complain about a smoky candle at home, but after enough days under a boat on Elephant Island, a smoky fire becomes both a blessing and a personal attack on the lungs. Wild maintained a routine. That was essential. He kept the men occupied, rationed food, organised work, and watched their spirits. Each morning he is often remembered as telling the men to get ready because the boss might come today. Whether the exact words were the same every day matters less than the habit behind them. He kept the idea of rescue alive as a daily possibility, not as vague hope, not as something too distant to imagine, but as something that could happen today. That kind of hope can be practical. It gets men up. It makes them maintain the camp. It makes them keep their belongings ready. It prevents despair from settling too comfortably. The men on Elephant Island were not all in good condition. Some were weak, some had frostbite. Perce Blackborough, the young stowaway who had joined the expedition secretly and then been allowed to remain, had suffered badly from frostbite in his feet. The doctors, Alexander Macklin and James McElroy, cared for him under extremely rough conditions. They eventually had to amputate toes, using limited equipment in a camp made from boats and canvas, with blubber lamps and all the difficulties of cold, hunger, and poor sanitation. It is a stark reminder that survival was not only about dramatic journeys, it was also about medical care, pain, patience, and men helping one another through procedures that would be hard enough in a proper hospital, let alone on a remote Antarctic island where the waiting room was mostly penguins. Still, the group held together. That is one of the remarkable features of the story. They were miserable, certainly. They were hungry, cold, dirty, and uncertain. They had every reason to be afraid, but they did not collapse into chaos. Wild's leadership, Shackleton's earlier discipline, and the character of the men themselves kept them functioning. They prepared for rescue. They kept watch. They repaired the shelter. They cooked what food they had. They endured weather that made the island feel less like a refuge and more like a punishment with scenery. As weeks passed, the waiting grew harder. The men had no way to know what had happened to the James Caird. Shackleton might have reached South Georgia. He might have missed it. He might have been lost at sea. He might be alive but unable to return. The men could not know. That uncertainty is difficult to imagine fully. A person can bear bad news sometimes, because at least it has shape. Not knowing keeps every possibility open, including the worst ones. The horizon stayed empty. Each day they could look out and see water, ice, weather, and no ship. Shackleton tried again. After the southern sky failed, he arranged another attempt with the Uruguayan vessel Instituto de Pesca No. 1. This too was blocked by ice. Again, he came as close as conditions allowed. Again, the sea and pack ice refused. Again, he had to turn back. A third attempt followed using the schooner Emma from Punta Arenas, but bad weather and conditions prevented that attempt as well. 3 tries, 3 failures. Each one must have been painful, not because Shackleton lacked effort, but because effort alone could not open the ice. The Antarctic had already taught him this lesson many times, but lessons do not become pleasant just because they are familiar. There is a kind of torment in almost being able to help. Shackleton was no longer trapped beside his men, but he was trapped by distance, ice, and the limits of available ships. He knew where they were, at least closely enough. He knew they were waiting. He had reached civilization, but civilization did not instantly solve the problem. That is another detail modern minds can miss. Rescue was not a button. It was ships, governments, captains, coal, weather, diplomacy, distance, and ice. Help had to be organised in the real world, and the real world often moves more slowly than fear would prefer. Eventually Shackleton received help from Chile. The small steam tug Yelcho, commanded by Captain Luis Pardo, was made available for another attempt. The Yelcho was not a powerful icebreaker. She was a modest vessel, not built for heavy Antarctic pack. She had no great comfort, no special equipment that made the journey easy, and no magical immunity to bad weather. What she did have was a capable and courageous captain, a crew willing to try, and the chance, if conditions held, to reach Elephant Island. On August 25, 1916, Shackleton set out again aboard the Yelcho. By then, more than 4 months had passed since the men had landed on Elephant Island, and more than 3 months since the James Caird had left them. Think of that. 3 months of waiting after watching the small boat disappear. 3 months of uncertain hope. 3 months of waking in the snuggery, eating what could be found, breathing smoke, listening to wind, and looking for a ship that did not come. Wild had kept them ready. He had kept saying the boss might come. It is one thing to say that for a week. It is another to keep the thought alive through repeated empty horizons. The Yelcho moved south through difficult waters. The weather for once allowed progress. The pack ice that had blocked earlier attempts was less severe or positioned differently, and the little vessel pushed toward Elephant Island. Shackleton must have been watching with every nerve awake. He knew how close success and failure could be. A change of weather, a shift in ice, a mechanical problem or poor visibility could ruin the attempt. The Yelcho had to find the island, reach the camp and get away again before conditions changed. On Elephant Island, August 30th, 1916 began like any other hard day. The men were going about camp life, still waiting, still enduring. Then someone saw a ship. At first, it must have been almost unbelievable. After so many days of empty water, the mind might resist what the eyes were seeing. A ship could be a trick of weather, a shape in mist, a hope arriving too suddenly to be trusted. But it was real. The Yelcho had come. The reaction was immediate. Men rushed, shouted, gathered and prepared. The camp that had been built for waiting became a camp for departure. Wild's daily readiness mattered now. They could move quickly because they had been kept prepared. Shackleton came ashore or close enough to confirm what he needed most to know. The famous question, in one form or another, was simple. Were they all well? Had everyone survived? And the answer was the miracle of the whole expedition. Every man was alive. Every man, after the Weddell Sea, after the ship was crushed. After months on drifting ice, after the open boat journey, after Elephant Island, after hunger, frostbite, cold, storms, failed rescue attempts, and more than a year and a half of danger, every man from the endurance party survived. It is such a clean fact that it can almost sound easy, so it needs to be said slowly in the mind. Not one of the 28 men was lost. The rescue itself had to be done quickly. Elephant Island was not a place to linger with a small vessel. Weather could shift. The sea could worsen. The men and their remaining gear were taken aboard the Yelcho. There was no need to preserve the camp except as memory. The snuggery, the rough shelters, the smoky cooking places, the hard sleeping spaces, all could be left behind. The men who had lived there for months were going back to the human world. Imagine the feeling of stepping onto the rescue vessel. The deck underfoot was still a ship's deck, moving with the sea, but it was not a drifting floe, not a lifeboat, not a frozen beach. There were other people. There was the promise of food, warmth, medical care, and passage away from the island. Some men must have felt relief at once. Others may have been too tired or stunned to feel it clearly. After long hardship, safety does not always arrive as a dramatic emotion. Sometimes it arrives slowly, as the body begins to understand that it no longer has to brace for the next immediate danger. For Shackleton, the rescue completed the only mission that still mattered. He had not crossed Antarctica. He had not achieved the geographic prize that had launched the expedition. The Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition had failed in its original purpose, but Shackleton had brought every man of the Endurance Party out alive. In the strange arithmetic of history, that failure became a greater story than many successes. It showed not the conquest of a continent, but the preservation of a crew. The Yelcho carried the rescued men away from Elephant Island and back towards civilization. When they reached Punta Arenas in Chile, they received a warm welcome. News of their survival spread. The world they returned to was still at war. The First World War had changed everything while they were gone. Some of the men would go on to serve, some would carry the effects of the expedition for the rest of their lives. They had spent so long in a world of ice and survival that returning to ordinary society must have felt both wonderful and strange. A street, a bed, a full meal, a clean shirt, a room with walls that were not made of canvas and overturned boats, all of it must have seemed almost excessive. It is worth remembering too that while all 28 men of the Endurance Party survived, the wider expedition had another side. The Ross Sea Party, sent to lay depots for Shackleton's planned crossing, suffered severely. They carried out their depot-laying mission under brutal conditions, even though the crossing party never came. 3 men from that side of the expedition died. Their story is often overshadowed by the survival of the Endurance crew, but it belongs to the same larger expedition and should not be forgotten. The full history contains both survival and loss. The Endurance herself remained beneath the Weddell Sea for more than a century, preserved in the cold, dark water. Her story lived through diaries, photographs, objects, accounts, and the memories of the men. Frank Hurley's images helped make the expedition visible to the world. Worsley's navigation became legendary. Wild's command on Elephant Island became a model of steady leadership. Crean's strength, McNish's carpentry, the doctor's care, the sailor's work, the cook's persistence, and the endurance of every man formed the result. Survival was not one man's achievement, even though Shackleton's leadership shaped it. It was a group effort held together by trust, skill, discipline, and the refusal to let hardship become disorder. So what do we take from this story? Sitting here more than a century later, far from the Weddell Sea, perhaps in a warm room where the greatest immediate danger is that the tea has gone a little cold, it is tempting to use words like heroism and courage, and they are not wrong. But the Endurance story is also about smaller, steadier things. It is about making a routine when the world has become uncertain. It is about watching over the difficult person as well as the easy one. It is about changing the goal when the old goal is gone. It is about not mistaking pride for leadership. It is about understanding that sometimes the greatest success is not the thing you set out to do, but the thing you choose to protect when everything else has failed. Shackleton began with a dream of crossing Antarctica. The ice took that dream away. It took the route, the schedule, the ship, and almost every familiar support the men had. What remained was responsibility. One man responsible for his crew, officers responsible for their teams, doctors responsible for the sick, sailors responsible for boats and gear. Each man responsible in some measure for not making despair heavier for the others. That is a quieter form of endurance, but perhaps the most important kind. And now, dear listener, we have followed them from the dream to the ice, from the ship to the floe, from the floe to the boats, from Elephant Island to South Georgia, and finally back to the waiting men. We have watched a grand expedition become a survival story, and a survival story become a lesson in patience, judgment, and care. The Endurance did not come home, but her men did. Every last one from Shackleton's trapped party returned from the ice. So, as the night settles around you, perhaps take a moment to notice the ordinary comforts nearby. The still floor beneath you, the roof overhead, the easy reach of water, the quiet certainty that your room will not drift north in the night, which is always a welcome feature in a room. These small things are easy to overlook, but stories like this return them to us with a little more weight. And if this frozen journey brought you a little calm, a little wonder, or simply a long quiet place to rest your thoughts, I would be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like, subscribed, or shared it with someone who enjoys slow stories from the far edges of the world. It helps this little space continue, one gentle journey at a time. Wherever you are listening from, whether it is late evening, early morning, or some quiet hour known only to you and your clock, I hope you're warm, safe, and at ease. The ice has closed behind us for tonight. The boats have reached shore. The rescue ship has come through the grey water, and every man, tired and weathered, has been counted aboard. Sleep well, fellow traveller, and may the ground beneath you stay still until morning.